The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the usual pre-dawn quiet of Havenwood, where the loudest sound might be a restless dog's collar jingling a few houses down, or the tired sigh of an old oak tree shifting in the breeze. This was a deeper silence. A heavy, unnatural hush that seemed to press in on the world, muffling the very heartbeat of the night. My eyes blinked open, drawn not by a noise, but by the profound lack of it. The red glow of my digital alarm clock read 3:01 a.m. I hadn't meant to wake up. My name is Ethan Carter, and for 32 years, my life had been a study in predictability. I worked as an architect, designing solid, dependable buildings that were meant to stand the test of time. My own life was built on a similar foundation: a steady job, a comfortable two-story house on a street lined with maple trees, and a routine so ingrained it felt less like a choice and more like a law of nature. Tuesday was trash day, Friday was pizza night, and the hours between midnight and dawn were for the dreamless, uninterrupted sleep of a man who knew exactly what the next day would bring. Until tonight. I sat up, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor felt cool beneath my feet. My wife, Sarah, was sleeping soundly beside me, her breathing even and slow, a picture of tranquility in the muted moonlight filtering through the blinds. She was undisturbed. Maybe it was nothing. A fleeting dream, a half-remembered nightmare that had tricked my senses. I stood up and walked to the window, parting the blinds with 2 fingers. Outside, Havenwood was a monochrome photograph. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows from the meticulously trimmed hedges of my neighbors. The Hendersons' prize-winning roses were just dark smudges in their yard. The Wilsons' minivan sat gleaming faintly in their driveway. Everything was exactly where it should be. Nothing was out of place. And yet, the feeling persisted, a low, humming anxiety in the pit of my stomach that told me something was fundamentally wrong. It felt like walking into a room and knowing an object had been moved, even if you couldn't immediately place what it was. The air itself felt different, thinner. I padded out of the bedroom and down the stairs, my hand gliding over the smooth oak of the banister. Our golden retriever, Buster, was asleep in his bed in the living room. Usually, the slightest creak of the stairs would have his tail thumping a hopeful rhythm against the floor. But he didn't stir. He was completely still, lost to a sleep so deep it looked almost like a performance. I reached down and touched his flank. It rose and fell with his breathing. He was fine. I was just being paranoid. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, the sound of the running tap startlingly loud in the oppressive quiet. I leaned against the counter, sipping the cool liquid and staring out the window above the sink into our backyard. The motion sensor light by the back door was off. The old wooden swing set we bought for our niece stood like a lonely skeleton near the fence. It was all so normal, it was beginning to feel abnormal. I pulled out my phone from my pocket. I brought it downstairs out of habit. The screen lit up, showing the time, 3:04 a.m., Wednesday, October 12th. I had a few notifications. An email from a client with a subject line about revised blueprints. A reminder about my dental appointment next week. A text message from my best friend, Michael. It had come in at 1:58 a.m. "You watching this meteor shower?" It read. "It's unreal. Stepped out for a smoke and the whole sky is on fire." I frowned. A meteor shower? I hadn't heard anything about it. I typed back a reply. "No, I was dead asleep. Woke up a minute ago though. Can you still see it?" I hit send. A moment later, I received a failure notification. Message not delivered. That was odd. I had full bars of service. I tried again. Same result. I switched to Wi-Fi. The icon showed a strong connection, but when I tried to open a web browser, the page wouldn't load. It just spun its little wheel, searching for a connection that was supposedly already there. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. It wasn't just the silence. The world had gone quiet in more ways than one. I went back to the living room and turned on the television. The screen flickered to life, displaying a bright blue background and the words, "No signal." I tried every channel. Static. Nothing. It was as if Havenwood had been severed from the rest of the world, enclosed in a bubble of perfect, silent isolation. I stood in the middle of my living room, the blue light of the TV screen casting eerie shadows on the furniture. The clock on the cable box was frozen. It read 2 a.m. Exactly 2 a.m. I glanced back at my phone. 3:07 a.m. A chill, colder than the kitchen tiles, washed over me. I walked over to the ornate grandfather clock that had been my father's, its steady rhythmic ticking a comforting presence in our home. It had stopped. The pendulum was motionless, the long, elegant hands frozen in place. They pointed to 2 a.m. My heart started to pound, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. I checked the microwave clock in the kitchen. It was flashing 12 o'clock, the telltale sign of a power flicker. But when had the power gone out? All the lights were working. My phone was charging before I unplugged it. The digital clocks, the ones connected to the network or the grid, seemed to be in chaos. The old, mechanical clock had simply died. Driven by a sudden desperate need for confirmation, I went back upstairs, moving more quickly now. I crept back into the bedroom and gently picked up Sarah's phone from her nightstand. The screen was dark. I pressed the power button. Nothing. It was completely dead, which was impossible. She charged it every single night without fail. I looked at her digital alarm clock on the same nightstand. Like the cable box, its display was frozen. It also read 2 a.m. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. Every digital clock connected to an external network had stopped at the same time. The internet was down. Cell service was out. What could possibly do that? A solar flare? An EMP? But those were things you read about in disaster novels, not things that happened to a quiet suburban town in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable October night. My gaze fell on my own wrist, where I wore the analog watch my father had given me for my college graduation. It was a beautiful, self-winding timepiece, a marvel of gears and springs that cared nothing for satellites or cell towers. I raised it to my face. The slender second hand was still sweeping smoothly around the dial. It was working perfectly, and the time it displayed was 3:12 a.m. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. So, time was still moving forward. It was just the digital world that had been crippled. But that still didn't explain the feeling, the oppressive silence, the sense of a missing piece. And it didn't explain the clocks. Why would a power surge, or whatever this was, freeze them at exactly 2 a.m.? Why didn't they just reset? I walked back downstairs, my watch a small, comforting weight on my wrist. I thought back to Michael's text at 1:58 a.m. He was outside, watching a meteor shower. 2 minutes before everything apparently went dead. Was he okay? Was it connected? My mind was a storm of questions with no answers in sight. I tried his number, but the call wouldn't even connect. Standing by the front door, I decided I couldn't just stay inside. I needed to see if it was just my house, my street. I needed to know if the wrongness I felt was real, or just a figment of a sleep-addled imagination. Quietly, I unlocked the deadbolt, the click echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. I turned the knob, pulled the door inward, and stepped out onto my porch, into the cool, still air of the early morning. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't just my house. It was the whole street, the whole town. Every single house I could see had its lights on. Not just a porch light or a stray lamp left on in a living room. Every window of every house was ablaze with light, as if every single resident of Havenwood had woken up at the exact same moment I had, and had all decided to turn on every light they possessed to ward off a darkness that was far more than just the absence of the sun. The silence was still there, but now it was accompanied by a blinding, universal, and utterly terrifying light. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that something had happened to us all between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. An hour had gone missing from our lives, and in its place, a silent, creeping dread had been left behind. For a long moment, I just stood there on my porch, a statue in the cold, silent theater of my street. The light pouring from every window wasn't warm or inviting. It was sterile, uniform, like the light in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. It felt like a collective, unspoken scream. We are awake. We are afraid. Something is wrong. My own paranoia was suddenly validated, but the comfort I expected to feel was absent. Instead, there was a new, broader fear. This wasn't happening to me, it was happening to all of us. Havenwood was trapped in a glass jar, and we were all just waking up to the fact. My first coherent thought was of the Hendersons next door. Bill and Carol. He was a retired history teacher, she was an avid gardener. They were in their late 60s, kind, and as predictable as the seasons. If anyone could offer a rational explanation, it would be Bill. I stepped off my porch, the crunch of a dry leaf under my sneaker sounding like a firecracker in the stillness. I crossed my lawn, the grass damp with dew, and walked up their driveway. Their pristine colonial home was lit up like a Christmas tree, every window a brilliant yellow square against the dark wood siding. I hesitated on their welcome mat. What was I even going to say? Hi Bill, sorry to bother you at 3 in the morning, but did the entire concept of 2 a.m. just cease to exist for you too? It sounded insane. But the evidence was all around me, blazing from their windows. I took a breath and pressed the doorbell. The chime, a cheerful little melody, seemed sacrilegious in the heavy silence. I waited. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. I was about to ring it again when I saw the curtain in the window beside the door twitch. A shadow moved behind it. Then, the lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches, stopped by the brass security chain. Bill Henderson's face appeared in the gap. He was in his pajamas, his white hair a mess, and his eyes, usually so calm and thoughtful, were wide with a frantic energy I'd never seen in him before. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice raspy. "What's going on? Is it your house too?" "My house too," I repeated, my own voice a low murmur. "Bill, what happened?" "I just woke up. A few minutes after 3. But my cable box, my wife's clock, they're all stuck at 2. He nodded, a jerky, anxious movement. 2. Exactly 2. Carol's tablet, the microwave, the smart TV in the den. All of them. The power must have flickered. "The lights are on, Bill," I said gently. "And it's not just our houses. Look." I gestured down the street. He peered through the gap, his eyes scanning the impossible scene. He let out a low groan. "My God," he breathed. "The Wilsons, the Millers, all of them." He looked back at me, his academic composure completely gone, replaced by raw confusion. I was reading in bed. Carol was asleep. I remember looking at the clock. It was 1:59. I turned the page in my book, and then I was blinking, and the clock on my nightstand said 3:02. And I felt strange. Like I'd just woken from the deepest sleep of my life, but I was standing up. "You were standing up?" "By the window," he confirmed, his voice trembling slightly. "Just standing there, looking out at the yard. I don't remember getting out of bed, Ethan. I don't remember anything after turning that page." An hour. An entire hour, plucked from his consciousness. The same as me. The same, it seemed, as everyone. We were all missing the same piece of time. "Is your phone working?" I asked. He shook his head. "No service. Internet's dead." I was about to try the landline when you rang the bell. "Let me know if it works," I said, though I already knew the answer. "Be safe, Bill." "You too, son," he said, his eyes darting back toward the street, a sentry at his post. He closed the door, and the lock clicked back into place. I walked back to my own lawn, the conversation doing little to calm my nerves. It only cemented the bizarre reality of the situation. We were all missing the hour from 2 to 3 o'clock. Michael's text suddenly felt like a message from another lifetime. 1:58 a.m. 2 minutes before the blackout. He was outside. He was looking at the sky. If anyone saw anything, it would be him. My worry for him sharpened into a spear of genuine fear. What if the meteor shower he saw wasn't a meteor shower at all? Back inside, I locked the door behind me. The house felt different now. It was no longer just my home. It was a fragile shelter in a world that had temporarily stopped making sense. Sarah was still asleep upstairs, oblivious. Part of me wanted to wake her, to have an ally in my confusion, but another part wanted to protect her from it for as long as I could. What would I even tell her that wouldn't sound like I was losing my mind? I tried Michael's number again. Straight to a deadline. Not even a voicemail prompt. I paced the living room, my mind a frantic loop of impossible scenarios. A secret military test gone wrong? A bizarre, localized atmospheric phenomenon? An astronomical event so strange that science had no name for it yet? Every theory felt both ludicrous and plausible at the same time. I went to the front window again, peering through the blinds. Down the street, a few other people were starting to emerge. Mr. Wilson was standing on his porch, his phone held up to his ear, his face a mask of frustration. I saw a curtain move in the Miller house and a woman's silhouette appear, just watching. We were like animals after an earthquake, cautiously emerging from our burrows, trying to understand if the danger had passed. There was no panic, no screaming, just a slow, creeping, communal realization. A silent consensus that the rules of the world had just been broken. My need to get to Michael became overwhelming. His house was on the other side of town, a 15-minute drive. He lived alone. If something had happened to him out there, no one would know. I had to go. I had to know he was okay. I scribbled a quick note for Sarah, just in case she woke up. Went to check on Michael. Phones are down. Everything is fine. Love you. It was a lie, of course. Everything was not fine. I left it on the kitchen counter where she'd be sure to see it. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door and my heaviest Maglite flashlight from the utility drawer. As I was about to leave, my eyes fell on my briefcase by the door. which held the architectural plans I'd been working on. The sheer, mundane normality of it struck me. Yesterday, my biggest concern was the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam. Tonight, I was worried the universe had sprung a leak. I opened the front door again, ready to head to my car. But I stopped on the threshold. My porch light cast a wide, pale circle on my front lawn. And right in the middle of that circle, something was wrong. It was a detail so small and strange that my brain almost dismissed it. A perfect, razor-sharp circle of frost on the grass. It was about 3 feet in diameter, a stark white ring on the otherwise green and faintly dewy lawn. The autumn night was cool, but it was nowhere near freezing. The rest of the lawn, the driveway, the roof of my car, nothing else had a trace of frost. It was just this one, geometrically perfect circle, shimmering under the porch light as if a piece of the winter moon had fallen and branded the earth. I walked slowly towards it, my heart thudding. I knelt down, the knees of my sweatpants instantly soaked with dew. I reached out a hesitant finger and touched the white grass. It was ice cold, brittle and sharp. It was real. This wasn't a trick of the light. It was a physical mark, a piece of evidence left behind by the missing hour. It hadn't just been a lapse in our consciousness. Something had been here. Something had touched down on my lawn while the whole town was asleep, or erased, or whatever had happened to us. And a terrifying new thought entered my mind. We hadn't just lost an hour. What if something had been taken? Or worse, what if something had been left behind? I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond my halo of light. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. I looked at the impossible circle of frost, then in the direction of Michael's house across town. He was out there when it happened. He was my only lead. I had to get to him. Now, leaving the mystery on my lawn behind, I turned and walked toward my car, the keys cold and heavy in my trembling hand. My hand was slick with sweat as I gripped the car door handle. The metal felt shockingly cold. Behind me, my house stood fully illuminated, a beacon of silent confusion in the night. The impossible circle of frost on the lawn seemed to pulse in the periphery of my vision, a brand left by an unseen iron. I couldn't stare at it any longer. Forcing myself to move, I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan, the familiar scent of leather and stale coffee doing nothing to soothe my frayed nerves. I put the key in the ignition and twisted it. The engine turned over with a roar that felt obscenely loud, a violent tearing of the night's silent fabric. Every instinct screamed at me to be quiet, to not draw attention, but attention from what, I had no idea. The dashboard lit up. As I expected, the car's digital clock was flashing a frantic, blinking 12 o'clock, having lost its mind like all the others. The radio was dead. Just a low, electronic hiss emanated from the speakers, the ghost of a signal. I put the car in reverse, my foot barely touching the accelerator. I backed out of my driveway, my eyes scanning the street. More people were outside now. Small clusters of 2 or 3 stood on their lawns, bathed in the light from their own homes, speaking in hushed tones. They weren't panicking, not yet. They were specimens in a petri dish, observing a change in their environment with a collective, cautious stillness. I saw Mrs. Gable from 3 houses down pointing up at the sky, her face etched with a question. Her husband just shook his head, his shoulders slumped in a gesture of utter defeat. They all looked like me, lost. I shifted into drive and started down the street, my headlights cutting a path through the strange twilight. The world beyond my windshield felt like a meticulously crafted movie set. Every house was a carbon copy of the last, every window lit, every porch glowing, a silent, town-wide vigil for a lost hour. I turned off my residential street and onto Maple Avenue, one of Havenwood's main arteries. The sheer scale of the event hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just my neighborhood. As far as I could see in either direction, the same unnatural brilliance stretched into the distance. The traffic lights at the first major intersection were dark, not flashing red or yellow, just dead. I slowed the car to a crawl, peering both ways before proceeding. The town was awake, but it was paralyzed. There were other cars, but none of them were moving with purpose like mine. A blue pickup truck was stopped in the middle of the intersection of Maple and 2nd Street, its driver's side door wide open, as if the driver had simply vanished mid-turn. A little further down, a pizza delivery car was parked haphazardly against the curb, its engine still running, casting faint exhaust clouds that swirled in my headlights. There was no sign of the driver. My mind struggled to assemble these disjointed images into a coherent narrative. What could have happened? People don't just abandon their cars mid-intersection. They don't just disappear from their delivery routes. It was as if a giant, invisible hand had reached down at 2 a.m. and pressed the pause button on the entire town of Havenwood. And then, an hour later, it had pressed play again, but the recording was damaged, leaving us all standing in the wrong places, with a piece of the tape missing. The frost circle. That was the detail that didn't fit. A technological failure, an EMP, a solar flare, those were abstract, invisible forces. But the frost was a physical clue, a tangible artifact. It meant something had been present. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. My fear was slowly being replaced by a grim, cold resolve. I had to get to Michael. He was looking at the sky. He was the only witness. As I drove through the deserted town square, the old clock tower came into view. The grand, four-sided clock, a mechanical relic like my father's watch, was a point of pride for Havenwood. But its hands were as motionless as the ones on Bill Henderson's grandfather clock. Frozen, pointing to 2 a.m. Even the old gears and springs had succumbed. My heart sank. The comforting thought that this was purely a digital plague was gone. This force, whatever it was, had been powerful enough to physically stop the gears of a 100-year-old clock. I was so lost in thought that I almost didn't see the car. It shot out of a side street, a dark SUV moving way too fast, its tires squealing as it ran the dead traffic light. I slammed on my brakes, my car lurching to a stop just inches from its passenger door. My heart hammered against my ribs. The SUV didn't even slow down. It just swerved around me and sped off into the night. It was the first sign of real panic I'd seen, a reminder that the quiet confusion could curdle into chaos at any moment. Shaken, I took a few deep breaths and continued on, my senses now on high alert. I was entering the part of town where the houses were spaced further apart, the street lights fewer and farther between. The woods that bordered Havenwood began to press in on the road, their dark, dense silhouettes swallowing the light. Michael had always liked his privacy. He'd bought a small house on the edge of the Havenwood Nature Preserve, with the forest as his backyard. At the time, I thought it was peaceful. Tonight, it felt menacing. The turnoff for his road, Chestnut Lane, was coming up. It was a narrow, poorly lit street with only a half-dozen houses on it. As I made the turn, my headlights swept across the street sign. And that's when my blood ran cold. Beyond the sign, further down the lane, I could see the houses. And they were all the same as the rest of the town, every window blazing with light. All of them, except one. At the very end of the cul-de-sac, where Michael's house should have been a beacon like all the others, there was only a pit of absolute darkness. A void. A single, gaping hole in the town's uniform tapestry of light and fear. His house was completely, utterly dark. No lights on inside. No porch light. Nothing. In a town where every single resident had apparently been jolted awake and switched on every lamp they owned, Michael's house was silent and asleep. Or it was empty. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine whining in protest as I sped down the final stretch of road, a singular, terrible question echoing in my mind. Was I driving to check on my friend, or was I driving toward the epicenter of it all? I killed the engine and my headlights died, plunging the world outside my car into near total blackness. The contrast was dizzying. Behind me, Chestnut Lane was a row of brightly lit houses, silent but awake. In front of me, Michael's property was a chasm of darkness. The silence that rushed in to fill the void left by my car's engine was different from the silence in my neighborhood. Here, at the edge of the woods, it was deeper, older. It was the patient quiet of the forest, and tonight, it felt predatory. I grabbed the heavy mag light from the passenger seat, its familiar weight a small comfort. The click of the button was sharp and definitive as a powerful beam of white light cut through the gloom, illuminating the front of Michael's small one-story home. It was a simple, well-kept house, but in the stark, isolated beam of my flashlight, it looked abandoned and haunted. "Michael!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak against the vast backdrop of the woods. "Mike, you in there?" The only answer was the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel. I got out of the car, leaving the door open, and walked up the short driveway. The air here was colder, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the preserve. My flashlight beam danced across the front of the house, the dark windows, the closed door. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, nothing to suggest a forced entry. It was just off. A single dark thread in a brightly woven quilt. I pounded my fist on the front door. "Michael, it's Ethan. Are you okay?" The sound was absorbed by the night, swallowed whole. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, listening. I heard nothing. No television, no footsteps, not even the hum of a refrigerator. A knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. Something was very wrong. I jogged around the side of the house, my light bouncing off the siding, painting grotesque, fleeting shapes on the trees that bordered the property. The backyard was cloaked in the same oppressive darkness. The sliding glass door that led from his living room to the small back patio was my best bet. As I got closer, I saw it. It was open. Just a few inches, a dark vertical slit in the reflection of the glass, but it was enough. A wave of cold dread and cautious relief washed over me. He could be inside. He could be hurt. I slid the door the rest of the way open, the rollers grating quietly on their track. "Michael!" I whispered into the darkness of his house. The interior was colder than the air outside. It was a dead, still cold. I stepped inside, my sneakers silent on the hardwood floor. The layout of the house was as familiar to me as my own. Living room, kitchenette, a short hallway leading to the bedroom and a study. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing a scene of mundane life, abruptly frozen. A laptop was open on the coffee table, its screen dark. A book lay face down on the arm of his favorite chair. In the kitchen, a coffee mug sat next to the coffee maker, half full. Everything was neat, tidy, and utterly normal, except for the profound emptiness and the cold. It felt like a place that had been vacated hours, or even days, ago. I checked the bedroom. The bed was made. The study was empty. He wasn't in the house. My heart, which had been pounding with fearful anticipation, now began to beat with a different rhythm, the slow, heavy thud of impending grief. He wasn't in the house, which meant he was still outside. Or had been. I went back to the living room, my gaze fixed on the open sliding door. That's where he would have been, watching the sky. I stepped out onto the small concrete patio. A small metal table and 2 chairs were the only furniture. On the table sat a pack of cigarettes, a disposable lighter, and an ashtray with a single, half-smoked cigarette extinguished in it. This was the place. This was where he was at 1:58 a.m., just before everything went wrong. He had stepped out for a smoke and to watch the sky, just like he'd texted. My flashlight beam moved from the patio table and swept across his backyard. It was mostly grass, about 50 feet deep, ending abruptly at the imposing, black wall of the forest. The grass was slick with dew, glittering like a carpet of tiny diamonds in my light. I took a step onto the lawn, then another, my eyes scanning the ground for anything. A clue, a sign, a dropped wallet, anything. And then the beam caught it. About halfway to the tree line, a small, dark object lay in the grass. I walked toward it, my breath catching in my throat. It was his phone. I knelt down, the dampness of the grass seeping through my jeans. I picked it up. The screen was facing up, and it was a spiderweb of cracks. But this wasn't the simple, linear cracking of a dropped phone. In the center of the screen was a discolored, milky white spot, about the size of a thumbprint. From this central point, the cracks radiated outwards not in sharp lines, but in strange, almost organic, feather-like patterns. It looked less like it had been shattered and more like it had been diseased, a crystalline fungus growing through the glass. The edges of the milky spot looked melted, fused. I tried the power button out of sheer, dumb instinct. Unsurprisingly, it was completely dead. I stood up, holding the ruined phone, my mind reeling. What could do this? I looked up from the phone, my gaze drawn inexorably toward the dark tree line. He was out here. He saw something. And he dropped his phone and he, what? Ran. As if on cue, I heard it. A sound. It wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustle of an animal. It was a low, resonant hum. It was so low on the auditory scale that I felt it in my teeth and in the bones of my chest before I could properly identify it as a sound. It was a deep, vibrational thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, yet it felt centered deep within the woods in front of me. It rose in pitch for a second, a clean, almost musical tone, before cutting off into absolute silence. My blood turned to ice. Every hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. That was not a sound of the natural world. It was mechanical, or electrical, or something else entirely. My hand, the one holding the mag light, was trembling, causing the beam of light to shake violently. I steadied it with my other hand and pointed it directly at the wall of trees, right where I thought the sound had originated. The powerful beam cut a path into the darkness, illuminating the first few feet of the forest. Gnarled tree trunks, tangled undergrowth, a carpet of dead leaves. Nothing. I swept the light back and forth, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw nothing, but I had heard it. I knew I had. Then, for a single terrifying instant, I saw a flicker. Deep in the woods, far beyond the effective range of my flashlight, something caught the edge of the beam and reflected it back at me. It wasn't the twin green reflection of an animal's eyes. It was a brief, sharp glint of bluish-white light. It was there for a fraction of a second, and then it was gone. I stood frozen in the middle of the yard, the cold seeping into my bones, Michael's bizarrely damaged phone in my hand. I was staring into the black, impenetrable maw of the Havenwood Nature Preserve. The hum was gone, the flicker of light was gone, but the feeling remained. I was being watched. Michael hadn't just seen a meteor shower. He had seen something else. Something that had come out of those woods, or gone into them. And my friend, my best friend, was either in there with it, or he had run for his life from it. And I was standing exactly where he had stood, completely alone, at the edge of an impossible darkness. Fear is a physical thing. It's a bitter metallic taste on the tongue, a vice of ice squeezing your lungs, a paralyzing cold that has nothing to do with the temperature of the air. I stood rooted to the damp grass in Michael's backyard, the strange, melted phone a useless weight in my palm. The woods before me were no longer just the Havenwood Nature Preserve, a place we'd hiked as kids. They were a hostile, alien territory, a curtain of black that had swallowed my friend and now seemed to be waiting for me. The silence that followed the hum was heavier, more profound, than anything I had experienced yet that night. It felt deliberate. The world was holding its breath, and I was at the center of its gaze. Every instinct for self-preservation, every rational thought, screamed at me to run, to get back in my car, drive away, lock my doors, and wait for a sun that might never rise. I could go home to Sarah, pull the covers over my head, and pretend the frost circle on my lawn was a trick of the light, pretend Michael's dark house was just a power outage, pretend his melted phone was a freak accident. But I couldn't. I couldn't unhear the hum or unsee the flicker of light. I couldn't erase the image of Bill Henderson's terrified face, or the sight of the abandoned pizza delivery car. And I couldn't abandon Michael. He was out there. He was my friend since kindergarten, the guy who stood next to me at my wedding, the one person I could call at any hour for any reason. If the roles were reversed, he would already be in those woods, shouting my name, consequences be damned. The choice was never really a choice at all. My fear was immense, but my loyalty, I discovered, was stronger. My paralysis broke. Action, even reckless action, felt better than standing there waiting for the unseen thing in the woods to make the next move. But I couldn't go in unprepared. My architect's brain, the part of me that planned and measured, took over. I turned and strode back to my car, my movements stiff and robotic. I popped the trunk. The small emergency light flickered on, revealing the familiar, mundane clutter within. A set of jumper cables, a bundled-up emergency blanket, a small first aid kit, and a heavy, four-way tire iron. The blanket and first aid kit were a necessity. If Michael was out there, he could be hurt, exposed. I grabbed them. Then my eyes fell on the tire iron. It was heavy, solid steel. In a world without rules, it was better than nothing. I hesitated for only a second before taking it. I shoved the blanket and kit into the pockets of my jacket and held the tire iron in my left hand, the mag light in my right. My phone was useless. Calling for help was a fantasy. No police, no ambulance, no one was coming. The entire town was in the same state of isolated confusion. I was completely and utterly on my own. I thought of Sarah, asleep and safe, I hoped, in our bed. If I didn't come back, she would wake up to my note about Michael. She would call his phone, then mine. And then she would start to worry. She would have no idea where I'd gone from here. I needed to leave a sign. A breadcrumb. I went back into Michael's kitchen, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic path, and grabbed the half-full coffee mug from his counter. The coffee was cold. I carried it back outside and placed it squarely on the hood of my car, right in the center. It was a bizarre, out-of-place object. Anyone who came looking for me, anyone who found my car parked here, would see it. They would know it wasn't just left here by accident. It was a message. I was here, and I didn't leave the way I came. It was the best I could do. With one last look at the strangely lit-up street behind me, I turned to face the forest. I carefully placed Michael's damaged phone into my pocket, a cold, hard piece of the mystery I was now a part of. Wielding the flashlight and the tire iron felt absurd, like a child's game of monster hunting, but the weight of the steel was a grim comfort. I walked back across the lawn, my boots leaving dark tracks in the dew. The tree line loomed before me like the shore of a dark ocean. Stepping across the threshold from the manicured grass to the wild undergrowth was like stepping into another world. The air instantly grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and pine. The ambient light from the distant houses was completely cut off by the thick canopy of branches overhead. My world shrank to the bouncing, circular tunnel of my flashlight's beam. "Michael!" I called out again, my voice now a strained whisper, unwilling to shout, to announce my presence too loudly to whatever else was listening. The forest absorbed the sound instantly. The only reply was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I took a step, then another, pushing aside a low-hanging branch that scraped wetly across my jacket. The ground was uneven, a tangle of roots and rocks hidden beneath a thick carpet of leaves. Every snap of a twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot. I was looking for any sign of his passing. A footprint, a piece of torn clothing, a broken branch that hung at an unnatural angle. But there was nothing. The forest floor looked undisturbed, as if no one had passed this way in years. My hope began to falter, my resolve threatening to dissolve into the overwhelming darkness. How could I possibly find him in this? It was an impossible task. I swept the flashlight in a wide arc, the beam catching on the textures of bark and the pale undersides of ferns. I was about to turn back, to reconsider this insane plan, when the light caught something. A flicker of white, just off to my left. It wasn't the white of a birch tree or a mushroom. It was too clean, too bright. I moved the beam back. There, on the dark, veined surface of a large oak leaf, was a patch of frost. It was a small, impossibly perfect circle, no bigger than a quarter, shimmering with a crystalline light of its own. My breath hitched. It was the same as the frost on my lawn. The exact same. I took a few steps closer, my light trained on it. It was real, cold to the touch, an icy anomaly in the mild autumn woods. As I stood there, staring at it, I raised my flashlight beam, pointing it deeper into the woods, in the direction the leaf was pointing. And I saw another one. About 15 feet further in, a patch of the same white frost adorned a flat-faced rock. It was a trail of bizarre, unnatural breadcrumbs. It wasn't a trail Michael had left. It was the trail of the thing he was following, or fleeing from. Every logical part of my brain told me to turn around, that following this path was a form of suicide. But it was the only lead I had. It was the only thing in this entire broken world that offered any kind of direction, any kind of answer. I looked at the first frosty leaf, then at the second gleaming patch on the rock deeper in the blackness. The path led away from the safety of the yard, away from the light, plunging into the dark, silent heart of the woods. Taking a deep, ragged breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of my heart, I tightened my grip on the tire iron and took the first step, following the impossible trail into the abyss. Plunging into the woods was like diving into black water. The world I knew vanished behind me, replaced by a suffocating darkness that my flashlight could only poke, never defeat. I moved from one shimmering frost patch to the next, each one a tiny, isolated star in a galaxy of black. They were spaced erratically, sometimes 10 feet apart, sometimes 20, forcing me into a stumbling, zigzagging path deeper into the preserve. My senses were screaming. Every rustle of a nocturnal animal was a predator stalking me. Every groan of a tree branch in the wind was a warning. The tire iron in my left hand felt both pathetically inadequate and reassuringly solid. My breath plumed in front of my face in the beam of the flashlight, a sign of the unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the trail itself. The further I went, the colder the air became. This wasn't the crisp, clean cold of an autumn night. It was a dead, sterile cold that felt like it was leaching the warmth directly from my body. I tried to keep my bearings, to make a mental map of my path, but it was impossible. The woods were a disorienting maze of identical-looking trees and tangled shadows. My sense of direction was gone, outsourced completely to the strange, frozen breadcrumbs. My life, at that moment, was tethered to a series of impossible ice crystals. After about 10 minutes of this tense, stop-and-go progress, I came across a marker that made me stop dead. It was another frost circle, this one on the trunk of a massive oak tree. But it wasn't near the base. It was a good 7 feet off the ground, a perfect white disc plastered to the rough bark. I reached up with the tire iron and tapped the edge of it. It was solid, hard as stone. Nothing in the natural world could account for this. No animal, no weather pattern. It was a footprint left by something that didn't obey the same rules of physics I did. Something that didn't need to touch the ground. A fresh wave of fear, sharp and nauseating, washed over me. What in God's name was I tracking? My resolve wavered. This was insane. Michael was gone. Getting myself killed in the dark wasn't going to bring him back. I took a half step backward, the urge to retreat, to run back the way I came, almost overwhelming. But as my light dipped downward with a movement, it illuminated something on the ground, just below the impossible frost mark on the tree. A boot print. It was a single clear impression in a patch of soft mud, the tread pattern distinct. It was a hiking boot, Michael's size, and it was fresh. The edges were still sharp and clear. He had been here. He had stood in this exact spot, probably looking up at the same frosty anomaly, just as confused and terrified as I was now. The sight of that footprint extinguished my urge to flee. He wasn't just a ghost I was chasing. He was a real person, who had been on the same path just a short time ago. My fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but now it was overlaid with a new layer of desperate urgency. I was on his trail. I was close. I pushed onward, moving with renewed purpose. The frost markers led me on, deeper and deeper still. The woods began to thin, the dense canopy of leaves giving way to a more open sky. I could see the faint, hazy glow of the moon through the high branches. A moment later, I stumbled out of the tree line and into a clearing. I froze, my flashlight beam cutting a wide swath. The clearing was perfectly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, as if drawn with a compass. And everything inside it was white. Not the white of snow, but the brilliant, crystalline white of the frost. The grass, the fallen leaves, the tangled briar bushes, even a slender sapling in the center. All of it was encased in a thick, shimmering layer of the impossible ice. The air here was frigid, biting at my exposed skin. It was a wound in the fabric of the forest, a place where all warmth and life had been instantly flash-frozen. My own lawn, the circle I had found there, had been a single drop of ink. This was the entire spill. This was the place. This was where it had landed, or emerged, or whatever it had done. This was the epicenter of the strangeness, the source of the cold. I walked slowly to the edge of the circle, my light tracing the razor-sharp boundary where the frozen ground met the normal, damp earth of the forest. There were no tracks leading out of it. Not Michael's. Not anyone's or anything's. My eyes were drawn to the center of the frosted circle. There, lying at the base of the ice-coated sapling, was an object. It was small and dark, a stark black shape against the glittering white. It was the only thing in the entire circle that wasn't covered in frost. Cautiously, I stepped into the circle. The cold was immediate and intense, like stepping into a commercial freezer. The frosted grass crunched loudly under my boots. As I got closer, I could see the object more clearly. It was a shard of something, about the size of my hand. It was jagged, as if broken off a larger piece. But its color was absolute black. It wasn't just dark, it seemed to drink the light from my flashlight. The powerful beam hit its surface and simply vanished, creating no reflection, no shine, no glint. It was a hole in the visible world. I knelt beside it, a primal sense of wrongness crawling up my spine. This thing did not belong here. It didn't belong anywhere on Earth. My curiosity warred with a powerful, instinctual revulsion. After a moment's hesitation, I reached out with the tip of the steel tire iron, my hand wrapped in the thick fabric of my jacket sleeve, and gently nudged the black shard. The moment the metal made contact, two things happened at once. The deep vibrational hum I had heard from Michael's yard returned, 10 times louder, emanating directly from the shard and vibrating up the tire iron into the bones of my arm. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force. At the exact same instant, a faint, internal network of pulsating, blue-white light ignited within the shard's impossible blackness. It wasn't casting light outwards. It was like looking at a captured storm, a web of silent lightning trapped within a cage of pure darkness. I yelled and scrambled backward, dropping the tire iron, which clattered loudly against the frozen ground. I fell hard on my backside, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The humming stopped. The light inside the shard died. It was once again just a piece of inert, light-swallowing blackness. But I had seen it. I had felt it. I was no longer a man searching for his lost friend. I was an unarmed witness who had just touched a piece of something that had broken our world, and in the terrifying, frozen silence of the clearing, I knew with chilling certainty that it was now aware of me. For a full minute, I lay there on the frozen ground, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The only sounds were the frantic drumming of my own blood in my ears and the faint, far-off rustle of the wind in the canopy, a sound from a world I no longer felt a part of. My mind, which had been struggling to find a rational explanation for the events of the night, finally gave up. Rationality had no place here. The neat, orderly blueprints of my life were useless in the face of a reality that operated on principles I couldn't comprehend. The word formed in my head, unbidden and terrifying: alien. It was a word from movies, from late-night radio shows, from fiction. It wasn't a word that belonged to a Tuesday night in Havenwood. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. My hip ached where I'd fallen. My gaze was locked on the black shard, now sitting inert and silent in the center of the clearing. It looked like nothing more than a strange rock, but I knew what it was. It was a key, a catalyst, a piece of the impossible. I had stumbled upon the what, but I still didn't have the who. Where was Michael? I retrieved my tire iron, its steel now feeling unervingly cold, as if the shard had stolen its warmth. I had to make a decision. Leaving this thing here felt wrong, like leaving a loaded gun at a playground. Taking it felt like picking up a live grenade. But it was evidence. It was the only tangible proof of what had happened here, aside from a circle of frost that would melt with the morning sun. I walked back to the edge of the clearing, my mind made up. I took the foil-like emergency blanket from my jacket pocket and unfolded it. It crinkled loudly in the frozen silence. Holding it like a net, I cautiously approached the shard again. I refused to touch it with my bare skin. Using the tire iron, I carefully rolled the light-absorbing object onto the blanket. It was heavier than it looked, settling into the foil with a solid thud. I quickly bundled the blanket around it, creating a makeshift, insulated package. The moment it was covered, I felt a fraction of the clearing's oppressive atmosphere lift, as if I had just put a lid on a boiling pot. Now, where did Michael go? The frost trail had ended here, in this frozen circle of devastation. But Michael hadn't ended here. His body wasn't here. I clutched my flashlight, the heavy blanket-wrapped shard tucked under my other arm, and began to slowly circle the perimeter of the clearing, my beam cutting into the dark wall of trees. On the side I had entered from, there was nothing but my own tracks. I continued around, sweeping the light across the base of the trees. It was on the far side, the side deepest into the preserve, that I found it. The undergrowth was trampled and broken. A thick, muddy patch of ground was churned up, not by a single clear boot print like the one I'd found before, but by a chaotic mess of sliding, digging heels. Several low-hanging branches on the trees were snapped, their pale wood showing like fresh wounds in the flashlight beam. This wasn't the trail of a curious observer. This was the trail of a man running for his life. Michael had been in that clearing. He had seen what I saw, or perhaps much more. And then he had turned and fled in absolute terror. The direction of the tracks led straight into the darkest, most untamed part of the woods. My heart sank. He wasn't a willing participant in this. He was a victim. He was prey. And whatever had been in this clearing with him was the predator. I had to keep going. Following the path of his panicked flight was my only choice. I took my first step onto his trail, and as I did, I heard a new sound. It was nothing like the clean, technological hum of the shard. This was a wet, rhythmic clicking. It was a sound that made the primitive part of my brain stand up and scream. It was organic, but hideously wrong. It sounded like a large insect, or like bones being gently knocked together. The sound was faint, but it was coming from the direction Michael had run. My blood ran cold. I was no longer an investigator. I was a pursuer. I was following my friend, but I was also following the thing that had made him run. The dynamic of the hunt had changed. Or perhaps I was just now realizing what it had been all along. I switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into a terrifying, near-total darkness, relieved only by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. I couldn't risk being a moving spotlight in the dark. I would have to rely on my ears, and flick the light on only for brief, necessary moments. I moved forward, my feet trying to find the quietest purchase on the leafy ground. The clicking sound was my only guide. It was slow, steady, and deliberate. It would click for a few seconds, then pause, then continue. It was the sound of something searching, or stalking. After a few minutes of this nerve-shreddingly slow progress, I risked a quick flick of my flashlight. The beam shot out, illuminating the path for a split second. The trail of broken branches and trampled ground was still there, leading onward. But in that brief flash of light, I thought I saw movement up ahead. It was just a flicker at the edge of the beam, a shape that detached itself from the shadow of a tree and melted back into the darkness. It was tall and impossibly thin. Its movement wasn't like a deer or a bear. It was smooth, fluid, and utterly silent. I didn't get a clear look. It was more an impression, a single frame burned onto my retina, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I ducked behind the wide trunk of an ancient oak, pressing my back against the rough bark. The wrapped shard under my arm felt like a block of ice. I held my breath, listening. The clicking was closer now, much closer. I peered cautiously around the edge of the tree, and then I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, moving slowly between the trees, was a light. It was a soft, pulsing blue-white light, the exact same hue as the light I had seen trapped inside the shard. It illuminated the creature that held it in brief, ethereal flashes. The light wasn't being cast from a device. It seemed to be emanating from a hand or an appendage. With every pulse of light, the rhythmic clicking sounded. Click pulse. Click pulse. It was moving methodically, deliberately, along the same path Michael had taken. It was hunting him. And I, hidden in the shadows, was now hunting it. My simple search for my friend had become something far darker and more dangerous. I was stalking a creature from another world, and the only things I had on my side were a tire iron and a rapidly diminishing reserve of courage. Crouched behind the ancient oak, I felt my world shrink to the space of a few heartbeats. My breath was a traitor, loud and ragged in my own ears. Ahead, the rhythmic pulse of blue-white light moved through the trees like a phantom lantern, accompanied by that sickening, organic click. Every instinct honed by millennia of evolution, the instincts that told my ancestors to flee the saber-tooth and fear the dark, was firing at once. But my feet remained rooted to the spot. Michael was on the other end of that trail. Following this thing was the only path that led to him. The terror of the unknown was immense, but the terror of abandoning my friend was greater. When the light had moved a sufficient distance away, I pushed off from the tree and began to follow. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever done. I became a shadow, a ghost in my own story. I moved with a caution I didn't know I possessed, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid a snapping twig or a rustling pile of leaves. I used the massive trunks of the trees as moving shields, peering around them to track my quarry before darting to the next point of cover. The blanket-wrapped shard under my arm was a cold, heavy weight, a constant reminder of the strangeness I was now entangled with. The click pulse of the creature was my guide. Click pulse, move. Click pulse, move. It became a horrifying rhythm, a metronome counting down the seconds of my life. The creature moved with a silent, fluid grace that was deeply unsettling. It didn't push through the undergrowth. It seemed to glide through it, its tall, thin form weaving between the trees with an unnatural ease. After what felt like an eternity of this tense, shadow dance, I saw the creature slow. It was entering a small grove where the trees were less dense, offering fewer places for me to hide. I saw my chance. A thicket of overgrown ferns and bushes stood at the edge of the grove, offering a perfect vantage point. I held my breath and scrambled the last 20 feet, diving into the foliage. The wet leaves slapped against my face, but I was hidden. I parted the fronds just enough to see. For the first time, I got a clear look at it. And the sight was a violation of nature. It was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and painfully slender, its limbs long and thin like those of a spider. It was covered in a smooth, chitinous exoskeleton that seemed to shimmer, shifting between a deep gray and an oily black in the pulsing light. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, elongated head that swiveled with a slow, inquisitive motion. Its arms ended not in hands, but in complex, multi-jointed appendages. One of these appendages was the source of the light, a series of semi-translucent plates that pulsed with that eerie blue-white glow from within. The clicking sound came from its head as a pair of small, delicate mandibles near the base of its skull gently tapped against each other. It was an insect, a reptile, and something born in a nightmare, all woven into one horrifying form. It paused in the middle of the grove, its head sweeping from side to side. It was scanning, hunting. My heart felt like it was going to seize. I was certain it would see the flicker of my terrified eyes through the leaves. But its attention wasn't on me. Its smooth, featureless face tilted downward. It had found something. It took a graceful, silent step forward and bent down. Its movements were alien, its knees and elbows seeming to bend in ways they shouldn't. It reached out its non-glowing appendage and picked something small and dark from the forest floor. It was a shoe. Michael's running shoe. I recognized the worn heel and the faded logo. He must have run right out of it in his terror. The creature held the shoe in its strange claws, bringing it close to its head. The clicking of its mandibles grew faster, more excited. Then, the appendage holding the blue light moved over the shoe. The light intensified, pulsing rapidly, washing over the shoe in waves of silent energy. It wasn't smelling the shoe, it was scanning it, analyzing its history, its owner, its scent, all with that cold, blue light. It was an act of intelligent, clinical investigation, and it was infinitely more terrifying than any animalistic snarl would have been. After a few moments of this silent analysis, the creature tossed the shoe aside. The light in its limb dimmed back to its regular, rhythmic pulse. The clicking slowed. It straightened to its full, intimidating height and swiveled its head, first to the left, then to the right. Then, it locked onto a direction. A new direction, slightly to the north of the path it had been following. It had found a new trail. A better trail. With a final sharp click of its mandibles, it began to move again, this time with a quicker, more purposeful stride. The hunt was back on, and it now knew exactly where it was going. I waited until its pulsing light had faded into the distant trees before I dared to breathe properly. My entire body was trembling. It took all my willpower to force myself out of the safety of the ferns. I had to see what it had been looking at, what it might have missed. I crept forward to the spot where it had stood. There, lying half buried in the mud and leaves, was Michael's shoe. But next to it, almost completely concealed, was something else. A dark leather rectangle. His wallet. The creature, in its alien focus on the shoe, had completely overlooked it. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It was damp and cold. I fumbled it open. Inside were his driver's license, a few credit cards, a $20 bill. All the normal artifacts of a human life. I almost closed it, but then my thumb brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked into an inner flap. It wasn't a receipt. It felt like notebook paper. With a growing sense of urgency, I pulled it out and carefully unfolded it. It was damp, and the ink was slightly blurred, but it was still legible. It was a map. A crude, hand-drawn map sketched in ballpoint pen. I recognized the layout immediately. It was the northern section of the Havenwood Preserve. There was a circle drawn on it, and next to it, Michael had scrawled the word, "Here." A thick, dark arrow pointed away from the circle, snaking through a series of squiggles meant to be trees. The arrow ended at another, larger shape, labeled with a single word, "Quarry." My mind raced. The old abandoned granite quarry. It was on the far edge of the preserve, a place we were told to stay away from as kids. It was remote, dangerous, and Michael was running towards it. He wasn't just fleeing blindly through the woods. He had a destination. He had a plan. He was running to the quarry for a reason. Suddenly, I wasn't just a terrified man stumbling through the dark. I had a destination. I had a heading. And I had a sliver of something I thought I had lost completely: hope. Michael was still thinking, still fighting. And now, I knew where to go. The flimsy, damp piece of paper in my hand felt more solid than anything else in my world. It was a map. It was a plan. It was proof that Michael wasn't just a terrified animal crashing through the undergrowth. He was a man, thinking, navigating, and fighting back in the only way he could. He was running to something, not just from it. The quarry. The knowledge settled in my mind, displacing a small measure of the terror and replacing it with a hard, sharp-edged purpose. This was no longer a stealthy pursuit into the unknown. This was a race. I looked in the direction the creature had gone, its pulsing light now just a faint, ghostly glimmer in the far-off trees. Following it was a fool's errand. It was moving with a slow, methodical pace, confident in its hunt. I couldn't afford to be methodical. I had to be fast. I knew these woods, maybe not as well as Michael did, but I knew the lay of the land. The quarry was to the northwest. The creature was heading north. I could cut across, take a more direct route. It would be harder terrain, a steep ridge and a creek to cross, but it would be faster. It had to be. My decision was made in a heartbeat. I shoved the map into my pocket, adjusted the cold, heavy bundle of the shard under my arm, and turned my back on the creature's path. I switched on my flashlight, abandoning stealth for speed. The beam cut a frantic, bouncing tunnel through the darkness as I began to run. A clumsy, stumbling run, half blinded by my own light, my lungs burning in the frigid air. The forest became a treacherous obstacle course. I scrambled up a steep, muddy embankment, my fingers digging into the soft earth, my feet slipping on loose rocks. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging scratches on my cheeks. The tire iron, still gripped in my hand, was a clumsy, awkward weight, but I refused to drop it. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the tall, thin shape of the hunter, and every sound, the hoot of an owl, the skittering of a small animal, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I was running on pure instinct, fueled by a cocktail of fear and hope. Why the quarry? The question hammered in my head in time with my pounding feet. It was the most remote, desolate spot in the entire preserve. It was a giant, open wound in the earth, surrounded by sheer, 100-foot drops. Was he trying to trap the creature? Or was there something else there? A hiding place? An escape route? The blanket-wrapped shard under my arm seemed to grow colder, heavier, a piece of alien malevolence I was foolishly carrying. I imagined it pulsing with that cold blue light, a beacon signaling my position to the thing in the woods. I had to fight the urge to hurl it into the deepest part of the forest, to rid myself of its corrupting presence. But I couldn't. It was the only proof of what was happening, and some part of me knew it was important, that its story was tied to Michael's. After what felt like hours, I heard the faint sound of running water. The creek. I knew I was on the right track. I half slid, half fell down the bank to the water's edge. It was shallow but wide, the water black and icy as it churned over a bed of smooth stones. I plunged in without hesitation, the shock of the cold stealing my breath and soaking me to the knees. As I stumbled towards the other side, I paused, my head cocked, listening. And I heard it. Far off to my right, carried on the night air, was the faint, rhythmic click-click-click of the creature. It was still moving, still hunting, parallel to my own path. The race was closer than I thought. The sound spurred me on. I scrambled up the far bank and pushed myself harder, my wet jeans chilling me to the bone. The terrain began to change. The rich soil of the forest floor gave way to gritty, sandy earth. The trees became sparser, more stunted. I began to see the skeletal remains of old mining equipment, a rusted or cart half swallowed by vines, a length of thick, corroded cable snaking into the dirt. The air smelled different, too. The damp, loamy scent of the woods was replaced by the dry, sterile smell of stone dust and stagnant water. I was close. I slowed to a walk, my lungs heaving, and finally, I broke through the last line of trees. The world fell away at my feet. I was standing on the edge of the abandoned quarry. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight. A vast, man-made canyon gaped open under the hazy moonlight, a giant bite taken out of the world. Sheer granite cliffs dropped away into shadow. Far, far below, the surface of the quarry's deep, black water was a placid, unblinking eye. On the far side, the silhouette of a derelict crane stood against the sky like a metal dinosaur skeleton. The place was a monument to silence and decay. "Michael!" I whispered, my voice a pathetic sound that the vast emptiness swallowed without an echo. There was no movement, no sign of life. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was too late, that he had been cornered here, that he was already at the bottom of that black water. Then I saw it. Across the immense gulf of the quarry, near the crumbling edge of the far cliff, a light flickered. A tiny pinprick in the vast darkness. It wasn't the cold, rhythmic pulse of the alien. It was the frantic, familiar beam of a human flashlight. It clicked on, then off. On, off, on. 3 short flashes. A pause. 3 long flashes. A pause. 3 short flashes. SOS. It was Michael. He was alive. He was signaling. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. He had made it. He was over there, waiting. I raised my own flashlight to signal back, my heart soaring. But just as my thumb found the switch, a sound from behind me froze the marrow in my bones. Click, click, pulse. The sound was no longer faint and distant. It was close. Terrifyingly close. It was coming from the path I had just emerged from. I had beaten it here, but only by seconds. I spun around, my relief curdling back into sheer terror. I was trapped. In front of me, my friend, alive but a chasm away. And behind me, the thing that had hunted him through the woods had finally, silently, arrived. Time seemed to stretch and snap. In one instant, I was filled with the soaring relief of finding Michael alive. In the next, the rhythmic clicking behind me acted like an anchor, dragging me back down into the depths of terror. I was a man standing on a knife's edge, a vast, empty chasm on one side, and a monster from the stars on the other. I was completely, hopelessly exposed under the pale moonlight. My muscles locked, my breath caught in my throat. To run was to be chased. To fight was to die. To scream felt like a final admission of defeat. Slowly, deliberately, the creature stepped out from the tree line. Bathed in the open moonlight, it was even more horrifying than it had been in the shadows. The light gave its gray, chitinous exoskeleton a wet, pearlescent sheen. Its limbs seemed too long for its body, moving with a silent, oiled precision that was purely mechanical, yet sickeningly alive. Its featureless head swiveled, first toward the frantic, now frozen pinprick of light across the quarry, then to me. It stopped, a predator that had cornered 2 prey at once. For a moment, the 3 of us, me, Michael, and the thing between us, formed a perfect silent triangle of desperation. Then, a voice, raw and shredded, echoed across the immense space, distorted and amplified by the granite walls. "Ethan! The shard! Get it to the crane house! Now!" It was Michael. His voice was a lifeline, a command that cut through my paralysis. The creature's head snapped in my direction, its mandibles beginning to click faster, the sound agitated, angry. The blue-white light in its appendage pulsed, brightening from a soft glow to an intense, focused beam that seemed to pin me in place. It knew I had the shard. The thing I had been carrying, the thing I thought was just evidence, was the prize it had been hunting all along. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The map, the quarry, the crane house. Michael hadn't been running here to hide. He had been running here to make a stand. This desolate, abandoned place wasn't a refuge, it was a weapon. The crane house was a crumbling brick structure about 30 feet to my left, perched precariously close to the cliff's edge. Thick, armored cables, cracked and weathered, snaked out of it and ran along the ground toward the skeletal remains of the main crane. The creature took a step toward me, its long, thin leg extending with silent menace. It was closing the distance. I had seconds. I couldn't outrun it. But Michael's plan, whatever it was, depended on me. I looked at the crane house, then at the creature. An idea, born of sheer, adrenaline-fueled desperation, exploded in my mind. "Michael!" I screamed back, my voice cracking. "Get ready!" I broke into a sprint, not away from the creature, but parallel to it, running along the quarry's edge directly toward the crane house. The creature let out a sound, not a click, but a high-pitched chittering screech that drilled into my ears, and changed its course to intercept me. It was faster than I could have imagined, its long legs eating up the rocky ground with an effortless, gliding stride. It was going to cut me off before I reached the door. I wouldn't make it. But I wasn't aiming for the door. 10 feet from the small brick building, I planted my feet, skidding on the loose gravel. The creature was almost on top of me, its glowing appendage raised like a weapon. With all the strength I had, I hurled the blanket-wrapped shard. The bundle flew through the air in a clumsy arc, not at the creature, but at the side of the crane house. It slammed against the brick wall right next to a large, rusted metal junction box where the main power cables enter the building. It fell to the ground, the blanket partially coming loose, exposing the shard's light-swallowing surface. The creature stopped its pursuit of me and immediately changed direction, its entire focus now on the shard. It glided toward the object, its movements almost reverent, its clicking slowing to a low, inquisitive purr. It reached out a clawed appendage toward its lost technology. It had taken the bait. "Now, Mike, now!" I shrieked, scrambling backward, away from the cliff. Across the quarry, Michael's light vanished. For a terrifying second, there was silence. Then, a loud mechanical clank echoed across the chasm, followed by the sputtering, wheezing cough of a heavy diesel engine struggling to turn over. A cloud of black smoke erupted from a rusty exhaust pipe near the base of the crane on the far side. Michael hadn't just been hiding. He had been working, frantically trying to breathe life back into the quarry's long-dead heart. The engine coughed again, caught, and then roared to life, the sound a glorious, deafening wave of human industry in the face of alien silence. The effect was instantaneous. The thick cables on the ground beside the crane house jumped and writhed like snakes. Blue sparks erupted from the rusted junction box. The creature, which had been reaching for the shard, recoiled, letting out that same high-pitched screech. And the shard itself, the shard reacted. It was no longer inert. The crude, unstable torrent of electricity flowing through the damaged cables created a powerful electromagnetic field, and the shard responded violently. The internal blue-white light didn't just pulse, it exploded outward. A blinding flash of energy erupted from the shard, engulfing the creature in a dome of pure, silent light. The creature's screech was cut off, replaced by a deep, tearing, vibrational hum that shook the very ground I stood on. The air crackled, and the smell of ozone, sharp and sterile, filled my lungs. I threw my arm over my eyes, but the light was too bright, searing through my eyelids. The hum rose in pitch until it was a physical pressure against my entire body. I felt a powerful concussive force, not of sound, but of pure energy, slam into me. My feet left the ground. The world became a chaotic, silent storm of white light and crushing force, and then mercifully, it became nothing at all. My first sensation was the grating of gravel against my cheek. My second was a high-pitched, piercing whine in my ears, the sound of a television that had been abruptly switched off. The world returned to me in disjointed fragments. The smell of burnt electricity and hot stone. The sight of a hazy, star-strewn sky, spinning slowly above me. A deep, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from the very center of my skull. I groaned, and the sound was a pathetic, dry rasp. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my body screaming in protest. The world swam back into focus. The deafening roar of the generator was gone. The horrifying click and screech of the creature were gone. All that remained was a profound, ringing silence. I was sitting on the edge of the quarry, my feet dangling dangerously close to the abyss. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering with a fresh jolt of fear. My eyes fell upon the spot where the creature and the shard had been. There was nothing there. Less than nothing. The ground was gouged into a shallow, circular crater about 10 feet across. The rock and earth inside it were blackened and melted, vitrified into a smooth, glassy surface that shimmered darkly under the moonlight. Of the creature, of the shard, of my tire iron, there was no trace. Not a shred of exoskeleton, not a smear of ash. Just a glassy, sterile wound on the earth, as if a piece of reality had been surgically excised. The trap had worked. But the result was an erasure so complete it felt just as terrifying as the creature itself. Ethan! The voice was real, human, and blessedly familiar. I looked up. A figure was running, stumbling, making his way around the curve of the quarry's edge from the direction of the crane. It was Michael. He was limping, his clothes were torn, and his face was a pale, wild-eyed mask of terror and exhaustion, but he was alive. He was solid and real in a world that had ceased to make sense. He reached me and collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip surprisingly strong, as if he needed to confirm I was actually there. "You're alive," he gasped, half a laugh, half a sob. "Oh my God, Ethan, I thought, that flash. I thought you were gone." "I'm okay," I managed, my voice hoarse. "Are you? What the hell was that thing, Mike?" He shook his head, running a trembling hand through his matted hair. "I don't know," he said, his eyes wide and unfocused as he stared at the glassy crater. "Not from around here, Ethan. Not from anywhere near here." He helped me to my feet, and we stood there for a long moment, two exhausted men leaning on each other at the edge of the apocalypse, the silence of the quarry a testament to the insanity we had just survived. "You have to tell me everything," I said, my voice gaining strength. "The text message, the meteor shower, all of it." Michael nodded, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He began to speak, his words tumbling out in a torrent, a desperate need to give voice to the nightmare he'd been living. "There was no meteor shower," he began, his voice low and urgent. "I was on my back porch. I saw a light, a flicker, deep in the woods. I thought it was kids with fireworks, maybe a drone. I'm an idiot. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out." He described finding the clearing, but when he arrived, it wasn't frozen. It was just strange. The air was buzzing, humming with energy. He saw something descend, not a ship with rivets and windows, but a shimmer in the air, a tear in the fabric of the night. And from that shimmer, the creature had emerged. "It didn't see me," Michael whispered, his eyes locked on the memory. "It was busy. It was carrying something, the shard you found. It planted it. It pushed it into the ground, and the whole clearing lit up. And that's when it happened. 2 o'clock. On the dot." He explained that the shard had emitted a silent, invisible wave of energy. He was at the edge of the clearing, and it hit him like a physical blow. It didn't knock him out, not completely. He described the missing hour not as a void, but as a period of intense, nightmarish confusion. His thoughts were scrambled, his short-term memory wiped clean every few seconds. He was conscious, but he wasn't coherent. It was a neurological storm, and it had fried his phone instantly. "That wave, Ethan, it must have washed over the whole town," he said, his voice trembling with the enormity of it. "A low-frequency neurological pulse. Enough to disrupt the brain's electrical signals, induce a temporary amnesiac state, and wipe out any unshielded electronics in its path. We didn't lose an hour. It was stolen from our minds." After the wave subsided, his head began to clear, and he watched in horror as the creature, its task complete, turned and began to move purposefully toward the lights of Havenwood. That's when he ran. "Why the quarry?" I asked, the pieces finally clicking into place. "The map. Best I could do," he said with a grimace. "I knew I was being hunted. I knew I couldn't go for help. But I remembered this place. Old tech. Analog. That generator is a diesel beast from the 50s, shielded in a brick house. I gambled that the pulse wouldn't have fried it. I figured if I could get the power running, I could create a massive electrical arc, a short circuit. I didn't know if it would work. I just knew their technology seemed to be energy-based. And sometimes, the only way to fight a fire is with a bigger, dumber fire." We stood in silence, the weight of his explanations settling over us. He had seen it all. He had understood what was happening and had formulated a desperate, brilliant plan, all while being hunted by a monster. The relief of our survival was immense, but it was quickly being replaced by a new, colder, and far larger dread. We were alive. The creature was gone. But the night was not over. I looked at Michael, and I could see the same thought reflected in his haunted eyes. "It was a scout, wasn't it?" I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. Michael nodded slowly, his gaze drifting from the crater up toward the vast, silent, star-filled sky. "That thing it planted," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The shard. It wasn't a weapon. It was a beacon. A marker. It was here to set up a signpost, to prepare the way. We didn't just kill a lone hunter, Ethan." He finally looked at me, his face pale and grim in the moonlight. "We just rang the dinner bell." Michael's words hung in the cold, dead air of the quarry, more chilling than any monster screech. "We just rang the dinner bell." The phrase echoed in the ringing silence, painting a horrifying picture in my mind. A single, silent scout, a beacon planted in the dark, and now a massive, explosive signal announcing our defiance to an unseen, unknown enemy in the void. We hadn't won. We had just fired the starting pistol for a war we didn't know we were fighting. The immensity of that thought was a physical weight. It was too vast, too cosmic for my exhausted mind to fully process. All I felt was a hollow, soul-deep weariness. We had survived the night, but we might have just doomed the world. We stood there for another minute, two insignificant specks on the edge of a man-made cliff, staring into a glassy crater that held the reflection of a billion indifferent stars. "We have to go," I said finally, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "We can't stay here." Michael just nodded, his face ashen. The journey back was a mirror image of our separate journeys in a somber, silent march through a forest that no longer felt merely dark, but watchful. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. My eyes darted between the shadows, half expecting to see another tall, slender form gliding between the trees. Were there more? Was that one truly alone? The paranoia was a poison, seeping into the cracks of my exhaustion. We didn't talk. There were no words for what we had just experienced. We were bound by a shared trauma that was too fresh, too raw to be touched by language. Michael leaned on me heavily as we walked, his limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline had faded. I felt the sharp sting of the cuts on my face and the deep, bruising ache in my hip and shoulder from the blast. We were two wounded soldiers retreating from a battle no one else knew had happened. It felt like a lifetime before we finally broke through the tree line and into the familiar clearing of Michael's backyard. The sight of his small, dark house was both a comfort and a fresh source of dread. Ethan's car sat in the driveway, a relic from another, saner world. The ridiculous coffee mug I had placed on the hood was still there, a silent testament to my desperate hope of just a few hours ago. Everything looked the same, but we were fundamentally changed. We were carrying the knowledge of the abyss back with us into the suburbs. The drive back into town was a surreal, dreamlike journey. The world was still broken, paused in the same state of silent, illuminated confusion. Every house on every street was still ablaze with light. We passed the same abandoned pizza delivery car, its engine having long since died, its headlights now dark. But seeing it all now, knowing the cause, was profoundly different. Before, it was a mystery. Now, it was a crime scene. The entire town of Havenwood was a piece of evidence. We were the only two witnesses who could explain what had happened, and our testimony was the stuff of madness. As we turned onto Main Street, we saw the first sign of official activity. A single Havenwood police cruiser was rolling slowly down the street, its blue and red lights flashing silently, painting the storefronts in hypnotic, revolving colors. The officer inside was just looking, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He was trying to solve a puzzle, and we were holding the answer key, an answer so unbelievable it would get us locked in a padded room. Who could we tell? How could we even begin to explain? I drove straight to my house. I pulled into the driveway, the crunch of the tires on the gravel sounding like an intrusion. My home, like all the others, was fully lit. The warm, yellow light from the windows had always meant safety, comfort, sanctuary. Tonight, it just looked fragile, vulnerable. "You should come in," I said to Michael. He was slumped in the passenger seat, staring blankly at my front door. He shook his head. "I can't, Ethan. I can't face anyone. Not yet. Just give me a minute." I understood. I wasn't sure I could face anyone either. I got out of the car and walked up the stone path to my front door. The note I left for Sarah was probably still on the kitchen counter. "Everything is fine." What a bitter, catastrophic lie that had turned out to be. I tried to compose myself, to smooth the lines of horror from my face, to look like a man who had just been out checking on a friend, not a man who had narrowly survived an encounter with an alien hunter. It was an impossible task. I slipped my key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. "Sarah!" I called out, my voice soft. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Even Buster wasn't stirring. I stepped into the foyer, my eyes adjusting to the bright indoor light. "Sarah, I'm home." A floorboard creaked upstairs. A moment later, she appeared at the top of the staircase. My relief at seeing her was instantly strangled by the look on her face. Her eyes were wide, her skin pale, and in her right hand, gripped with white-knuckled intensity, was the largest knife from our kitchen block. She wasn't looking at me with relief. She was looking at me with a desperate, frantic plea. My name came out of her mouth as a choked, terrified whisper. "Ethan!" My blood turned to ice. "Sarah? What is it? What's wrong?" She didn't move from the top of the stairs. She just raised a trembling hand, the one not holding the knife, and pointed toward the back of the house, in the direction of our kitchen. Her voice was barely audible, a thread of pure terror. "There's someone in the house," she whispered. "It came in through the back door an hour ago. It hasn't moved. It's just been standing there, watching the woods." The world, which had been a whirlwind of frantic motion and explosive noise, slammed into a dead, silent stop. Every sound in the universe ceased to exist except for the frantic beat of my own heart and Sarah's terrified, whispered words hanging in the air. "It's just been standing there, watching the woods." My mind refused to accept it. It was impossible. We had destroyed it. We had vaporized it in a flash of brilliant, cerulean energy. But Sarah's terror was real. The knife in her hand was real. The unseen presence in my kitchen, a room where we ate breakfast and paid bills, was horribly, nightmarishly real. Had it followed me? Had it somehow survived? Or was this another one? My training as an architect, a man who thinks in terms of structure and procedure, took over. I raised a hand slowly, signaling for Sarah to stay absolutely still, to make no sound. Her eyes, wide and pleading, were locked on mine. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. I put a finger to my lips, then pointed back at our bedroom door. "Go. Lock it." She understood, backing away from the stairs with the slow, deliberate movements of someone trying not to startle a wild animal. I retreated, pulling the front door closed with an infinitesimal click. The cool night air hit my face, a slap of reality. Michael was still in the passenger seat of the car, his head in his hands, but he looked up the moment he saw my face. My expression must have been a mask of pure horror. "What is it?" he asked, his voice strained. "Ethan, what's wrong?" I rushed to the car, my words coming out in a frantic, choked whisper. "There's another one. Michael, it's in my house. It's in the kitchen." The exhaustion vanished from his eyes, replaced by a surge of feral rage. "Another one," he hissed, his hand reaching for the door handle. "I'll kill it." "No." I grabbed his arm, my grip tight. "We don't know what we're dealing with. Sarah's in there. We can't just go in blind." The rage in his eyes subsided, replaced by the same cold fear that was gripping me. He was right to be angry, but I was right to be cautious. We were no longer in the wilderness, where brute force and desperate gambles were our only tools. This was my home. My wife was feet away from the thing. "Okay," Michael breathed, forcing himself to be calm. "Okay, what's the plan? We can't call anyone." "We look first," I said, my mind racing. "We need to see what it is, what it's doing." The dining room window. It looks right into the kitchen. We got out of the car, moving with the silent, practiced stealth we had learned in the woods hours earlier. We crept along the side of the house, staying low, below the level of the windows. The familiar comfort of my own home had been twisted into a hostile landscape. The prize-winning roses Sarah was so proud of were now just obstacles, their thorns catching on our clothes. We reached the dining room window. I took a deep breath, trying to quiet the frantic hammering in my chest, and slowly, carefully, raised my head to peer over the sill. Michael came up beside me a second later. The lights in the dining room and kitchen were on, casting a bright, clinical glow. And there, in the center of my kitchen, it stood. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't another hunter. This creature was entirely different. It was shorter, probably only 5 feet tall, and had a delicate, almost fragile build. It wore a seamless, form-fitting suit the color of burnished silver that clung to its slender frame. It had no visible joints or armor, just a smooth, unbroken surface. Its hands were exquisite and complex, with at least 6 long, slender fingers that moved with a surgeon's precision. But most unsettling was that it wasn't watching the woods at all. It was standing at my kitchen island, its back to the window that looked out over the yard. It was completely engrossed in studying the mundane objects we had left there. I saw it reach out one of those long, delicate fingers and gently touch a half-eaten apple Sarah had left on a cutting board. It didn't pick it up, it just made contact, its head tilted with an air of intense, scientific curiosity. Then it moved on, its attention drawn to a glass of water. It repeated the gesture, its finger just barely grazing the surface of the glass. And as it did, a perfect tiny circle of crystalline frost bloomed on the glass at the point of contact, identical to the ones we had seen on the leaves and rocks in the forest. A jolt of understanding shot through me. This wasn't the hunter. This was the one leaving the trail. This was the one that had been on my lawn. The tall, insectoid creature wasn't the master. It was a guard dog, a tracker. This delicate, silver-suited being, this was the scientist. And my kitchen, my home, was its laboratory. The cold, clinical nature of it was 1,000 times more terrifying than the aggressive predator in the woods. We weren't being hunted. We were being studied. We were specimens. As we watched, paralyzed by this revelation, the creature turned its head. It didn't turn toward us. It turned slowly, its movements fluid and precise, toward the front of the house, as if it could see right through the walls to the street beyond. It seemed to be listening, sensing something we couldn't. A car passing, a neighbor's motion sensor light. Then, with a calm deliberation that sent a wave of ice through my veins, it turned its head the rest of the way, until it was looking directly at the window. Directly at us. Its face was smooth and pale, dominated by two large, black, almond-shaped eyes. They were eyes without pupils, without emotion, vast and deep as the night sky. They weren't angry. They weren't scared. They were simply aware. It knew we were there the whole time. It had been ignoring us, deeming us irrelevant to its work. My heart stopped. I was certain it would now screech, or run, or attack. Instead, it did something that shattered my remaining sense of sanity. It slowly raised one of its 6-fingered hands, not in a gesture of violence or threat, but with a serene, unnerving calmness. It held its hand up, palm facing us, and then extended a single slender finger. It was a gesture that transcended language, a command that was as clear as any word. A single, silent gesture held the world hostage. The creature's finger, slender and pale, remained extended for a long moment. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. A statement of such profound confidence and superiority that it bypassed all my higher brain functions and spoke directly to the terrified, primitive core of me. I see you. I am in control. Do not move. And we obeyed. Michael and I were frozen outside the window, two statues in a garden of suburban horror, our breath held, our hearts stopped. The cold glass of the window pane was the only thing separating us from an intelligence so vast and alien that my mind couldn't even begin to grasp its edges. Then, as calmly as it had raised its hand, it lowered it. The moment of direct engagement was over. It turned its back on us, a gesture of dismissal so complete it was more insulting than any attack. It glided from the kitchen island to the large bay window at the back of the kitchen, the one that looked out over our yard and toward the dark, imposing wall of the Havenwood Nature Preserve. This was the window Sarah said it had been watching. It stopped before the glass and placed one of its long-fingered hands flat against the pane. I braced myself for the bloom of frost, for the glass to crack under some unseen pressure. But nothing of the sort happened. Instead, a soft, internal luminescence began to build within the creature's palm, the same ethereal blue-white light from the quarry, from the shard. The light intensified, not frosting the glass, but projecting straight through it, casting a focused circular beam into the darkness of my backyard. The beam shot across the manicured lawn, illuminating the lonely swing set in a ghostly glow, and ended on the impenetrable blackness of the tree line. For a moment, there was nothing. The beam of light held steady, a silent question posed to the woods. And then, the woods answered. Deep within the trees, a single point of blue-white light blinked on in response. Then another appeared a few yards to its left. Then 3 more, further down the line. Within seconds, a constellation of impossible stars was being born in the forest. One became a dozen became 50, until the entire dark expanse of the woods behind my house was glittering with dozens, perhaps hundreds, of the same soft, pulsing, otherworldly lights. The breath I had been holding escaped my lips in a choked, soundless gasp. Michael made a small, wounded noise beside me. His theory, our theory, had been catastrophically wrong. We hadn't destroyed a lone beacon and alerted a distant fleet. The explosion at the quarry had been nothing more than a car backfiring in a sleeping city. It had simply woken them up. They weren't coming. They were already here. They had been here all along, dormant and hidden in the woods that bordered our quiet, peaceful lives. Havenwood wasn't a landing site. It was a forward operating base. The scientist in my kitchen held its glowing hand against the window for a moment longer, as if taking a final roll call. Then, the light in its palm faded to nothing. Its task, whatever it was complete. It turned from the window, its movements unhurried, and glided to the back door. It ignored us completely, our presence now a confirmed but trivial detail in its larger plan. We were the ants on the picnic blanket, briefly interesting but ultimately beneath notice. It opened the door, stepped out into the night, and vanished into the shadows of the backyard, moving silently toward the newly awakened army in the trees. The moment it was gone, the invisible chains that had held us shattered. Sarah, I gasped, my first thought, my only thought. I scrambled up and sprinted for the front door, Michael right on my heels. I burst into the house, my feet pounding on the hardwood floors, and took the stairs 2 at a time. Sarah! I yelled, my voice raw with panic. I reached our bedroom and found the door locked. I twisted the knob, rattling it. Sarah, it's me. Open the door. I heard the deadbolt slide back, and the door swung open. She was there, huddled in the corner, the knife still clutched in her hand. I rushed to her, pulling her into an embrace, my entire body trembling with relief. She was safe. She was shaking, crying silently, but she was safe. It's gone, I whispered, stroking her hair. It's gone. You're okay. What was it, Ethan? She sobbed into my shoulder. What was happening? I had no answers I could give her, no explanation that would make any sense. As I held her, trying to project a calm I was nowhere near feeling, Michael moved past us. He went to the large window in our bedroom, the one that, like the kitchen window below, overlooked the backyard and the woods. He stood there for a long moment, completely still, looking out into the night. I managed to get Sarah to her feet, my arms securely around her. I looked over at Michael, about to say something, to suggest we get out of the house, get as far away from here as possible. But the look on his face stopped me cold. He was rigid, his hands pressed against the glass, his expression one of dawning, ultimate horror. Michael, I said, what is it? He didn't turn around. His voice, when it came, was a choked, hollow whisper, the sound of a man watching the world end. Ethan, he breathed. They're not staying in the woods. They're coming out. They're coming into the neighborhood. I left Sarah's side and moved to the window, a sense of grim inevitability pulling me forward. Michael's words echoed in my head, a death knell for the quiet world we once knew. He wasn't wrong. The view from my bedroom window, once a comforting tableau of manicured lawns and familiar rooftops, had become a scene from a silent, apocalyptic film. The blue-white lights were no longer just distant, mysterious stars in the woods. They were moving. Dozens of them poured from the tree line in a steady, silent river, fanning out across the backyards of my neighbors. They moved with a chilling coordination, a sense of shared purpose that spoke of a hive mind or a perfectly drilled army. There was no sound, no snapping twigs, no shouted commands, just a relentless, fluid advance. As they drew closer, emerging from the deep shadows of the woods into the ambient glow from the houses, their forms became clear. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the tall, insectoid hunters or the delicate, silver-suited scientists. There was a third type. They were shorter and bulkier than the hunters, built with a brute strength that was evident in their thick limbs and heavy, deliberate movements. They carried no visible lights or tools. They were simply walking bastions of muscle and chitin, their dark carapaces absorbing the light. They were the soldiers, the grunts, the physical force of this silent invasion. We watched, a trio of terrified ghosts at the window, as the systematic occupation of our street began. The creatures split into small, mixed-species fire teams. A scientist, 2 hunters, and one of the bulky soldiers would approach a house, surrounding it with tactical precision. The soldier would stand guard, a motionless and intimidating sentinel. The hunters would glide around the perimeter, their featureless heads swiveling, scanning for threats. And the scientist would get to work. We saw one of them approach the Hendersons' house next door. It placed its slender, glowing hand on the siding of their living room wall. The light pulsed softly, and I had the horrifying realization that it was scanning the house, reading the layout, counting the occupants, taking inventory of a life's worth of possessions with a simple touch. Then, it moved to the front of the house. It calmly reached out and touched their mailbox, leaving a perfect, shimmering frost circle on the little red flag. It was a mark of ownership, a catalog number. The Hendersons, my kind, elderly neighbors, were no longer residents. They were inventory. Panic began to rise in my throat, hot and acidic. I looked at Sarah. She was staring at the scene, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it had gone past screaming into a state of pure, catatonic shock. Michael was grim, his face a hard mask, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence. A single, muffled scream from a few streets over, cut off abruptly. The quiet confusion that had blanketed Havenwood was finally beginning to break. Curtains were being drawn. A porch light on the far end of the street flickered off, a futile attempt to hide. But there was no hiding. And in that moment, the true diabolical nature of the night's first event crashed down on me. The lights, I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Oh my God, Michael, the lights. He looked at me, his eyes dark. What about them? It wasn't a side effect, I said, my voice trembling with a horrified awe for their strategy. The pulse at 2 o'clock, waking everyone up. We all stumbled out of bed, confused and scared, and we all did the same thing. We turned on the lights to ward off the darkness. The horror dawned on Michael's face. They made us identify ourselves, he breathed. Every lit-up house is a target. A confirmed location of active, conscious inhabitants. It wasn't a glitch. It was a census. A way for them to tag every cage in the zoo. Our sanctuary, our home, was nothing but a brightly lit bullseye. We were trapped. The creatures were already filtering between the houses, their silent patrols covering the street. The backyard was a no-go zone, a steady stream of them still emerging from the woods. Our only conceivable escape route was the car in the driveway, but that was at the front of the house, a space they now completely controlled. We have to get out of here, I said, my voice low and urgent, trying to snap Sarah out of her trance. Sarah, honey, listen to me. We have to go. Now. She just shook her head, her eyes still locked on the silent horrors unfolding outside. Where can we go, Ethan? Where? I didn't have an answer. But we couldn't stay here. We were fish in a barrel. We had to try. The car, I said to Michael. If we can get to the car. Look, Michael whispered, his voice tight. He pointed. My gaze followed his finger. A single, silver-suited scientist had detached from the group, cataloging the house across the street. It was gliding across the lawn, directly toward our house. It moved with that same unhurried, infuriating confidence. This was it. Our turn. We watched from the upstairs window as it stopped on our front porch. It surveyed the door, its head tilting in that curious, analytical way. Then, it raised its slender, six-fingered hand. It didn't try the knob. It didn't knock. It simply placed its palm flat against the solid oak of our front door. A large, perfect circle of frost bloomed on the wood, the intricate, feathery patterns of ice shimmering under the porch light. We had been marked. We were officially catalogued. Then, a sound from downstairs cut through the silence. A soft, metallic click. It was a sound I knew intimately, a sound I heard every single night. It was the sound of the deadbolt on the front door. We watched in utter disbelief as the small knob on the inside of the lock began to turn, slowly, impossibly, on its own. A second click echoed up the stairs as the lock slid open. The creature wasn't breaking in. It was unlocking the door from the outside with its technology, peeling open our final layer of defense as easily as opening a can of soup. The barrier between us and them was gone, and it was about to come inside. The click of the deadbolt unlocking was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a sound of absolute finality, the sound of a key turning in a cage that had once been our home. In the ringing silence that followed, a new and terrible chapter of the night began. The three of us stood frozen in the upstairs bedroom, a tableau of captured prey. We were no longer watching the invasion, we were now officially part of it. Every nerve in my body was coiled, listening, waiting. The groan of a floorboard, the sigh of the house settling. Every normal sound was now a harbinger of the thing that was about to step inside. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an unbearable, silent eternity. Then we heard it. The slow, deliberate creak of the front door swinging inward. There was no crash, no violent entry. Just a soft, polite opening, as if an invited guest had arrived. A brief pause, and then the sound of soft, nearly inaudible footsteps on the hardwood floor of the foyer. It was inside. The paralysis that had gripped me finally shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. We couldn't wait here. We couldn't let it corner us in this room. Move, I hissed, my voice a dry crackle. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her away from the window, pushing her toward the far wall of the bedroom. Michael, the dresser. Help me. Understanding dawned on Michael's face. Action, any action, was better than waiting to die. Together, in a frantic, desperate silence, we lunged for the heavy oak dresser that stood against the wall. It was my grandfather's, a solid, heavy piece of furniture that took 2 movers to get up the stairs. Now, fueled by terror, we slid it across the floor with a series of grunting heaves, the legs scraping horribly against the wood. We slammed it against the bedroom door, wedging it tight under the knob. It was a pathetic, flimsy barricade against a creature that could unlock doors with its mind, but it was all we had. It was a gesture of defiance. We were still fighting. We backed away from the door, breathing heavily, our eyes wide in the dim light of the bedroom. And we listened. The soft footsteps from downstairs continued, unhurried. It was exploring. I imagined it gliding through my living room, its large, black eyes taking in our family photos, the books on our shelves, the entire architecture of our lives. I could hear the faint, delicate tap of its slender fingers on the wooden banister of the staircase. The violation of it, the cold, clinical intrusion into our most personal space, was a unique and profound horror. The window, Michael whispered, his eyes darting to the back of the room. It's the only way. He was right. The bedroom was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap, and we had just sealed ourselves inside it. I rushed to the window, the one overlooking the backyard. I peered out cautiously. The scene was worse than before. The silent invasion was in full swing. Blue-white lights pulsed in the yards of all my neighbors. The bulky soldiers stood like statues in the shadows. The hunters glided between the houses, their patrols methodical and unbroken. To go out, there was to step directly into the lion's den. But then my architects, I saw a route. A chance. Our bedroom was situated directly above the sunroom we'd added to the back of the house 5 years ago. The sunroom's roof, a gently sloping surface of asphalt shingles, was about 10 feet below the window. It would be a hard jump, risky, but not impossible. From that roof, we could scramble down the trellis on the side of the house, into the narrow, dark space between our property and the Hendersons. It was a desperate, insane gambit, and it was our only hope. The roof, I said, pointing. We can make it. We can get to the side of the house and then, we run. Just as I spoke, the sounds from downstairs stopped. The silence stretched. And then, a new sound began. The soft, deliberate tread of footsteps on the stairs. It was coming up. A wave of pure panic washed over me. Go, go, go. I hissed, fumbling with the lock on the window and sliding it open. A blast of cold, ozone-scented air filled the room. Sarah, you first. I'll lower you down as far as I can. Sarah was frozen, her eyes locked on the barricaded door. I can't, she whimpered, her body trembling. Ethan, I can't. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They stopped. The creature was now standing in the hallway, directly outside our door. We were out of time. You have to, I said, my voice strained with desperation. I grabbed her, trying to pull her toward the open window. Michael moved to help, his face a grim mask of resolve. And then, a new sound came from the door. Not a knock, not the turning of a knob. It was a low, resonant hum, the same sound the shard had made at the quarry, but softer, more focused. We looked at the door in horror. A network of delicate, feathery frost was blooming on the wood, spreading out from the edges of the doorframe. The creature wasn't going to bother with our crude barricade. It was simply freezing the entire door, the wood groaning and contracting under the intense, unnatural cold. The hum intensified. The frost spread, thick and white, encasing the door in a crystalline shell. The footsteps in the hall were gone, replaced by this single, terrifying note. Then, with a sound like a pistol shot, a loud crack echoed through the room as the frozen wood of the doorframe began to splinter. Time was up. It was now, or it was never. The cage was breaking. We had to jump. The sharp, splintering crack from the bedroom door was the only catalyst we needed. The time for thought, for fear, for hesitation, was over. There was only action, raw and desperate. Sarah was still paralyzed by terror, her feet rooted to the floor as if the alien's silent command from the window still held her in its grip. I didn't have time to be gentle. I grabbed her around the waist, lifted her off her feet, and half-carried, half-dragged her to the open window. I won't let you fall, I grunted, my words a ragged promise. You have to go. Now. Michael was right there, helping me guide her legs over the sill. The drop to the sunroom roof below looked like a plunge into a black, unforgiving ocean. For a heart-stopping second, she clung to the window frame, her knuckles white. Another loud crack echoed from the door, this one louder, closer. The hum intensified. That was enough. With a choked sob, Sarah let go. I held her wrists for as long as I could, lowering her down before her weight pulled her from my grasp. She dropped the last few feet, landing on the sloping shingles with a muffled thud and a spray of loose asphalt grit that sounded like a landslide in the night silence. Michael, you're next, I ordered. He didn't hesitate, swinging his legs out and dropping with an agility that surprised me, landing in a low crouch beside Sarah. I scrambled onto the windowsill, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I took one last, fleeting look back into my bedroom. The heavy oak door was now a grotesque work of art, almost completely encased in a thick, crystalline frost that glittered in the lamplight. As I watched, a final violent tremor ran through it, and the entire door imploded, shattering inward into a million glittering razor-sharp shards of frozen wood. And there, standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the light of the hall, was the silver-suited scientist. It didn't screech. It didn't charge. It simply stood there, its head tilted, watching me with those vast, black, unreadable eyes. It was letting us go. Or worse, it was simply documenting our escape route. I didn't wait to find out. I threw myself out the window, landing hard on the roof, my ankle twisting painfully beneath me. A sharp, searing pain shot up my leg, but I bit back a cry, scrambling on my hands and knees to Michael and Sarah. "The trellis," I hissed, pointing to the wooden lattice covered in climbing roses that ran up the side of the house. "It's our only way down." The trellis groaned and creaked under our combined weight, the dry wood threatening to snap with every move. Michael went first, testing each foothold. I helped Sarah go next, her body still trembling, her hands struggling to find a grip. I followed last, my injured ankle screaming in protest. Every creak, every scrape of our shoes against the wood, felt like a broadcast announcing our position to the entire occupying army. Finally, our feet touched the damp grass of the narrow, dark passage between my house and the Hendersons. We collapsed against the cool brick of my neighbor's wall, huddled together in the deep, concealing shadows. We were out. We were free of the immediate trap of the house, but we had escaped into the heart of the prison yard. I risked a peek around the edge of the house. The view was 100 times more terrifying from ground level. A bulky soldier stood just 20 yards away in the Hendersons' backyard, a silent, dark monolith. Its presence was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like it was bending the space around it. Further out, on the street itself, a hunter glided past, its movements unnervingly smooth, its featureless head sweeping from side to side. We were surrounded, our escape route to the car completely cut off. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here," Michael breathed, his eyes scanning the patrols. "We have to move. From shadow to shadow. Get further away from this house. It's a hot spot now. They know we're out." He was right. But as he spoke, a motion from the house next door caught my eye. The Hendersons' front door was opening. I pulled Michael and Sarah back into the shadows, my heart leaping into my throat. Was a creature coming out? But it wasn't a creature. It was Bill Henderson. My neighbor, the kind, retired history teacher. He stepped out onto his brightly lit porch, dressed in the same pajamas I'd seen him in hours ago. But his face was a blank slate. His eyes were open but vacant, staring straight ahead at nothing. He moved with a slow, shuffling gait, like a sleepwalker. A moment later, his wife Carol emerged behind him, her expression identical, her movements just as sluggish and robotic. Then, the silver-suited scientist that had been in my house, or one identical to it, emerged from the doorway behind them. It didn't touch them, didn't shove them. It simply glided behind them, its presence a silent, inexorable command. With a gentle, almost hypnotic motion of its slender hand, it guided the entranced couple down their porch steps and onto the front lawn. They didn't fight. They didn't even seem to be aware of what was happening. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't an extermination. It wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. They weren't just cataloging the houses and their contents. They were collecting the occupants. My neighbors weren't being attacked. They were being gathered, like docile sheep being led from a pen. And the horrifying, unspoken question hung in the air between us. Gathered for what? We watched in mute horror as Bill and Carol Henderson were led away from the life they had built. They shuffled past their prize-winning roses, their faces empty, their movements guided by the silent, graceful alien that followed them like a shepherd. They were joined by a bulky soldier who fell into step, an honor guard for the abducted. They didn't look back. They didn't seem to realize they were leaving everything behind. The creature led them out to the street, where they joined a small, shambling procession of our other neighbors, all in the same trance-like state, all being silently escorted down the road toward an unknown, unthinkable fate. The truth of it settled into my bones, a cold, heavy certainty. "They're not killing us," Michael whispered, his voice ragged with disbelief. "They're collecting us." The hope I'd clung to, that we could hide, wait for morning, wait for the National Guard, wait for this nightmare to end, evaporated. There would be no waiting it out. Hiding was just a delay of the inevitable. If we were found, we wouldn't be attacked. We would be assimilated, gathered up, our consciousness wiped clean like a hard drive. The primal fear of being eaten by a predator was replaced by the existential dread of being erased, of having my very identity, my love for my wife, my entire history, switched off like a light. "We have to move," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but firm. "We can't stay here. They know we were in that house. They'll be looking for us." But where could we go? The street was a parade of the damned. The backyards were crawling with patrols. We were stranded on a tiny, dark island in a sea of monsters. Then, an idea sparked. "The Miller's house," I breathed. "2 doors down. They're in Florida for the week. I saw their post on social media yesterday." Michael and Sarah looked at me. The logic was simple, desperate, and it was the only logic we had. In a world where light meant death, or worse, darkness was the only camouflage. The aliens, with their systematic logical approach, were targeting the houses that were lit up, the ones they had flushed out with their 2 a.m. neurological alarm clock. A dark, empty house should be beneath their notice. It was a gaping hole in their data set. Okay, Michael agreed, his face set in a grim mask of determination. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got. We go from shadow to shadow. No noise. At all. And so began the most terrifying journey of my life. It wasn't a frantic run through the woods or a desperate leap from a window. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the uncanny valley our neighborhood had become. We moved from the deep shadow of my house, across a brightly lit patch of lawn that felt as wide and exposed as a desert, and into the concealing darkness of the Hendersons' massive oak tree. Every step was a calculation. Every breath was a risk. We crouched behind the tree, my arm tied around Sarah, who was trembling uncontrollably but moving with a silent resolve that amazed me. From our new vantage point, we could see the street more clearly. The procession of our neighbors was growing, a silent, shuffling line being led toward the town square. We saw scientists methodically marking doors with their icy signature. We heard the soft, rhythmic click-click-click of a hunter's mandibles as it glided past the end of the driveway, its featureless head sweeping back and forth. The air hummed with a low, almost subsonic energy, the collective thrum of their technology at work. Our next move was the most dangerous. We had to cross the Wilsons' backyard. It was a wide, open space with only a small hedge for cover. Michael went first, a low, swift shadow against the grass. He made it to the hedge and signaled for us. I took Sarah's hand. "Ready," I whispered. She squeezed my hand, her only reply. We ran. For 5 seconds, we were completely exposed, illuminated by the light pouring from the Wilsons' own windows. I expected a screech, a sudden pulse of blue light, the heavy, thundering footsteps of a soldier. Nothing. We dove behind the hedge, our hearts hammering against our ribs, our lungs burning. We had made it. We were unseen. 1 more yard to cross. The Millers' property. Their house was a comforting block of pure darkness ahead of us. We crawled the final stretch on our hands and knees through their overgrown flower bed, the damp mulch soaking through my jeans. We finally reached the back of the house, collapsing against the foundation in the pitch-black shadow of the rear wall. We were here. We were safe. The basement window, I gasped, remembering countless neighborhood barbecues where Dave Miller had complained about it. The latch has been broken for years. I found the window, a small, ground-level rectangle thick with cobwebs. I pulled on it, and just as Dave had always promised, the latch gave way with a soft, metallic scrape. The window slid open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over us. It was the smell of safety, of sanctuary. Michael slid in first, his landing a soft thud on the concrete floor below. He reached up to help Sarah, guiding her through the narrow opening. I was last. I swung my legs in, my injured ankle sending a fresh spike of pain up my leg. Just before I dropped down into the darkness of the basement, I paused, looking back out at the impossible scene, at the silent, orderly nightmare consuming my world. And then my heart stopped. A pair of heavy, chitinous feet, the feet of a bulky soldier, stomped to a halt on the grass directly in front of the window, not 5 inches from my face. I froze, my body half in, half out of the window. A second later, a pair of more delicate, silver-clad feet joined them. The scientist. My eyes darted up. The creature's featureless head was tilted down, looking at the window I was in, at the scuff marks we had just made in the dirt. The dark houses were not being ignored. They were being investigated. My sanctuary had just become another trap. Before I could even think to move, a slender, 6-fingered hand descended into my field of vision. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its long fingers reaching down, not for me, but for the edge of the window I had just slid open. Time seemed to dissolve. My entire existence was reduced to the space of a few inches, the grimy glass of the basement window, the impossible, slender fingers of the alien reaching down, the terrified, upturned faces of my wife and my best friend in the darkness below me. I was a bridge between 2 worlds, the human and the alien, and I was about to be the reason we were all discovered. I was paralyzed, caught in the creature's silent, observational gaze. But the hand did not reach for me. It did not smash the glass. With a clinical detachment that was somehow more chilling than overt aggression, its long fingers gently touched the wooden window frame. A delicate, feathery circle of frost instantly bloomed on the old, peeling paint. It was tagging the point of entry. It was filing a report. My mind screamed. It knows. It knows we're here. Then, the scientist produced a small, silvery object from a fold in its seamless suit. It was a cylinder that unfolded into a complex, multi-lensed device. The creature held it up to the window, and the device emitted a low, soft hum. A thin, brilliant blue line of light shot from the device, piercing the darkness of the basement. It was a scanner. The light was the only catalyst I needed. The spell of paralysis broke, and I dropped, tumbling the last few feet into the basement and landing in a clumsy, painful heap on the cold concrete. The scanner beam sliced through the air above my head. "Down!" Michael hissed, grabbing the back of my jacket and dragging me across the floor. He shoved me and Sarah behind a hulking, ancient furnace that stood in the center of the room, its octopus-like ductwork providing a maze of shadows. We huddled together in the darkness, pressing ourselves against the cold, dusty metal, trying to will ourselves invisible. The blue line of light began to move. It swept across the basement with a methodical, unnerving precision. It moved over stacks of old newspapers, a child's forgotten bicycle, shelves lined with jars of preserved fruit. It was taking a perfect, three-dimensional inventory of the miller's forgotten things. The beam slid up the side of the furnace, passing inches over our heads. I could feel its strange, cold energy on my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain that this was the end, that an alarm would shriek, that the hunters would pour in through the window. The beam passed over us. It completed its sweep of the room and then retracted back into the device with a soft click. The humming stopped. Through the grimy window, I saw the silver-clad feet and the heavy, chitinous feet turn and walk away. The sound of their movements faded into the night. They were gone. A wave of vertiginous, disbelieving relief washed over me. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for a full minute. We had done it. We were hidden. The darkness and the clutter of the basement had shielded us. For the first time that night, a fragile, trembling shoot of hope began to grow in my chest. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the frantic pounding of our own hearts. There were no more sounds from outside. Just the oppressive, watchful silence of the occupied town. I think we're clear," I whispered, my voice hoarse. Michael slowly, cautiously, raised his head to peek over the furnace. He looked toward the window. "They're gone," he confirmed, his voice filled with a weary astonishment. "They must not have seen us. They must have just been checking the empty houses." But just as the words left his lips, a new sound reached us. It came from inside the house, directly above our heads. A soft, rhythmic click. It was the sound of a hunter's mandibles. My blood turned to ice. Michael and I locked eyes, the same horrifying realization dawning on us at the exact same moment. They hadn't missed us. This was a trap. The scan of the basement wasn't to find us. It was to confirm that the supposedly empty house had been breached. By tagging our entry point, they knew how we had gotten in. They hadn't needed to follow us into the cramped, cluttered basement. They had simply walked around to the front of the house, unlocked the door with their silent, frost-inducing technology, and let themselves in upstairs. They had us cornered. The basement, our supposed sanctuary, was a tomb. The only way out was the wooden staircase that led up to the kitchen, a staircase that would deliver us directly into their hands. We were utterly, completely trapped. The soft clicking from upstairs stopped. A new set of footsteps, lighter, gliding, joined the silence. They stopped, too, directly above us. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked up at the thick wooden floorboards of the kitchen ceiling, at the ancient pipes and wiring that snaked across it. I held my breath, waiting. A new sound began. A high-pitched, resonant whine, like a dentist's drill but without the grating friction. It was a sound of pure, focused energy, and it was coming from the floor right above our hiding spot. It grew louder, more intense. A single brilliant point of blue light pierced the wood, and a wisp of smoke curled down into the darkness of the basement. The light began to move, burning a razor-thin, glowing line through the floorboards. My mind finally understood. They weren't going to bother with the stairs. They were simply going to cut a new door. Dust and glowing embers began to rain down on us as the blue line of light traced a perfect, unwavering circle in the ceiling above us. They were carving their way in, and we were caged rats, watching the lid of our trap being surgically, patiently, removed. The high-pitched whine of the cutting tool was the sound of a closing casket. We were huddled behind the furnace, three terrified souls in a concrete box, watching our doom being meticulously carved out above us. Glowing embers and splinters of superheated wood rained down, each one a countdown to the inevitable. The glowing blue circle in the ceiling was nearly complete. There was no escape. No windows left to break, no doors to barricade. This was the end of the line. Sarah was crying softly, her face buried in my shoulder. Michael was a statue of coiled rage, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, a man ready to fight a battle he knew he couldn't win. My own mind was a maelstrom of panic, a frantic, useless cycling of dead ends. But then, through the terror, a different part of my brain, the architect, the problem solver, the man who understood systems, kicked in. It was a desperate, primal instinct, not for a weapon, but for a mechanism, for a way to change the equation. My eyes darted around our cramped, dusty hiding place. They traced the octopus-like arms of the furnace's ductwork, the tangle of electrical conduits, the water pipes. And then they landed on it. A thick, black iron pipe, about an inch in diameter, running from the wall to the base of the furnace. It had a bright yellow shut-off valve near the joint. It was the natural gas line. An idea, utterly insane and lethally dangerous, bloomed in the darkness of my mind. It was a suicide play, a final, desperate act of defiance. We couldn't fight them. We couldn't escape them. But we could make this basement a place they would regret entering. "Michael," I whispered, my voice a strained, urgent rasp. He tore his eyes from the ceiling and looked at me. I didn't have to say the words. I just pointed at the gas line. His eyes followed my finger. He looked at the pipe, then back at me. For a second, he just stared, his mind processing the sheer, self-destructive madness of the idea. Then, a grim, almost feral understanding dawned on his face. He nodded once, a sharp, definitive jerk of his head. He understood. Chaos was our only weapon. "Sarah," I said, my voice as gentle as I could make it. "Honey, I need you to go to the far corner of the basement. Get under that old workbench and cover your head." "No." "Ethan, what are you doing?" she sobbed, clinging to me. "Creating a diversion," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I kissed her forehead. "Go, please." Michael was already moving, scrambling silently to the other side of the basement where Dave Miller's dusty, forgotten workbench stood against the wall. He began rummaging through the clutter of old cans and tools. The glowing circle above us was now complete. The high-pitched whine stopped, plunging the basement into a terrifying, expectant silence. "Got it," Michael hissed. He came scrambling back, a heavy, 18-inch pipe wrench in his hand. At that exact moment, the circular section of the kitchen floor above us gave way. It didn't just fall, it seemed to disintegrate, collapsing inward in a shower of splintered wood, dust, and debris. A perfect, glowing-edged hole now opened into the brightly lit kitchen above. And framed in the circle were our nightmares. A silver-suited scientist, flanked on either side by the tall, chitinous forms of two hunters. They stood motionless, peering down into the darkness, their featureless heads tilting as they assessed the new terrain. "Do it," I grunted at Michael. He fit the heavy jaws of the wrench around the main joint of the gas pipe. He grunted, putting his entire weight into it, his muscles straining. The old, rusted joint groaned in protest, but didn't budge. Above us, one of the hunters shifted, its long, slender limbs moving to the edge of the hole. It was preparing to drop down. "Together," I said, grabbing the handle of the wrench with him. We both pulled, our feet slipping on the dusty concrete. The metal shrieked. A sharp crack echoed through the basement, and the joint broke. A powerful, sustained hiss filled the room as flammable, mercaptan-scented natural gas began to pour into the enclosed space. The creatures above reacted instantly. Their heads snapped toward the sound. The scientists took a half step back from the edge. They understood chemistry. They knew what was happening. The hunter that was about to jump down paused, its alien mind calculating the new, immediate threat. But it was too late to be cautious. They had to come for us. The hunter dropped, its long legs absorbing the impact as it landed silently on the concrete floor 10 feet away. It straightened to its full, terrifying height and began to advance toward us. "Now what?" Michael gasped, his eyes wide with panic. "How do we light it?" My heart sank. He was right. He had dropped his lighter at his house. The power was out. The furnace's pilot light had been extinguished by the blast of gas. We had filled our tomb with explosive fuel, but we had no match. The hunter was getting closer, its mandibles clicking with a low, predatory rhythm. My eyes, blinded by desperation, scanned the debris that had rained down from the ceiling. Wood, insulation, and a wire. A severed electrical wire from the kitchen, its copper guts exposed, was dangling down and twitching, spitting small, intermittent yellow sparks where it made contact with a metal heating duct. It was our spark, our ignition, our miracle. The hunter was only a few feet away now, its strange appendage raised. It was over. "Get down!" I screamed, the first loud sound I had made since entering the house. I lunged from behind the furnace, grabbing a long, splintered piece of the floorboard. Sarah shrieked my name from the corner. The hunter turned its full attention to me. I didn't hesitate. I used the piece of wood to hook the sparking wire, pulling it free from the ductwork and shoving it, with the last ounce of my strength, directly into the invisible, hissing cloud of gas that was now filling the room. For a fraction of a second, the world was silent, the yellow spark arcing through the air. And then, the world turned to fire. There was no sound, no bang, just a silent, universe-ending flash of white light and a wave of pure, crushing pressure. The world ceased to be a place of shapes and sounds and became a physical force that picked me up and threw me like a stone. I remember a brief, violent sensation of tumbling through a storm of heat and splinters, and then the world was gone, replaced by a deep, suffocating darkness. Consciousness returned painfully, in fits and starts. It began with a single high-pitched, unending tone, the sound of a dead signal in my own skull. Then came the pain, a dull, global ache that settled into a sharp, searing fire in my shoulder. I coughed, and a cloud of thick, acrid dust filled my lungs, sending me into a racking, body-shaking spasm. I opened my eyes. I was looking at a chaotic lattice of broken, blackened wood against a hellish, orange-red sky. I wasn't in a basement anymore. There was no more ceiling. I was lying on my back in a crater of smoldering debris, looking up through the skeletal remains of a house at the night sky. The plan had worked. It had worked with a catastrophic, world-breaking violence I could never have imagined. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood, melted plastic, and cooked natural gas. Small fires burned all around me, casting flickering, dancing shadows. My own pain, my own survival, was an irrelevant detail. "Sarah!" I croaked, but the sound was swallowed by the ringing in my ears. I couldn't hear my own voice. I pushed myself up, my shoulder screaming in protest. A large, jagged piece of splintered wood was embedded in the thick muscle near my collarbone. I ignored it. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through my disorientation. I began to claw at the wreckage around me, my hands raw, my only thought a frantic, repeating prayer. "Please be alive. Please be alive." I saw a flash of her blue pajama pants under a large, overturned section of the workbench. I dug like a madman, tossing aside broken boards and chunks of drywall. And then I saw her. She was curled into a tight ball, her arms over her head. The heavy workbench had acted as a shield, a crude bomb shelter that had saved her life. "Sarah!" I put my hands on her, and she flinched, then her eyes fluttered open. They were wide with a terror that went beyond words, but she was conscious. She was alive. I pulled her into my arms, burying my face in her hair, my body shaking with a relief so profound it felt like a second explosion. Then, a groan from a few feet away. "Michael!" He was half buried under a pile of collapsed ductwork and flooring, his face pale and covered in dust, a dark, ugly gash bleeding freely on his forehead. One of his arms was twisted at an unnatural angle. As I helped Sarah to her feet and we stumbled toward him, the world outside the ruin of the house began to intrude. The silence was gone. The night was now filled with a cacophony of new sounds. The blaring, frantic sirens of car alarms. The distant, rising shriek of a house's smoke detector. And human sounds. Shouting. Screaming. The orderly, silent harvest had been shattered. Our desperate, suicidal act of defiance had ripped the lid off the quiet horror, and now chaos was pouring into the streets. We pulled Michael free. He cried out in pain as we moved his arm, but he was conscious, his eyes wild and fierce. "Did it work?" he grunted, spitting a mouthful of bloody dust onto the ground. I looked around the inferno of the basement. Of the hunter that had dropped down, there was nothing. No body, no fragments. Just a blackened scorch mark on the concrete where it had stood. Through a gaping hole in the foundation, I saw one of the bulky soldiers, its chitinous armor on fire, staggering blindly across the lawn before collapsing into a heap of smoldering ruin. The explosion had done more than just create a diversion. It had proven they were not gods. They could be hurt. They could be killed. The aliens were in disarray. Their silent, coordinated dance had devolved into a frantic scramble. Some were retreating, melting back toward the woods. Others were converging on our location, their movements no longer calm and deliberate, but jerky and agitated. The hive had been kicked, and the hornets were swarming. "We gave them a bloody nose," Michael gasped, a grim, triumphant smile on his face. He looked at me, the firelight dancing in his wild eyes. "This is it, Ethan. This is our chance. The only one we're gonna get. They're all looking here. The car. We have to go. Now." He was right. This was the eye of the storm, the singular moment of chaos we could use as cover. Helping Michael to his feet, with Sarah supporting his other side, we began our escape. We stumbled out of the shattered foundation of the Miller house into a scene from a war zone. The house was now fully engulfed in flames, a massive funeral pyre roaring into the night sky. People were emerging from their houses, their trance-like states broken by the sheer violence of the blast. They were running, screaming, their minds unable to process the sight of their tranquil suburban street now occupied by giant, insectoid creatures and burning homes. We ran, a clumsy, three-person unit, through the screaming chaos. We used the confusion as a shield, dodging panicked neighbors and agitated aliens alike. We made it across the lawns, back to the familiar sight of my own house. The porch light was still on. The car was still in the driveway, a solid, dependable promise of escape. We scrambled inside, slamming the doors, the sound of the chaos momentarily muffled. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely fit the key into the ignition. Outside, one of the hunter creatures turned its featureless head toward us, its mandibles clicking. It had seen us. It started to glide in our direction. I twisted the key. The engine turned over, sputtered, a horrible, gut-wrenching sound of mechanical hesitation. Please, I begged, please, not now. The hunter was getting closer. I turned the key again. The engine caught, coughed, and then roared to life with a sound that was sweeter than any symphony. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into reverse, my foot stomping the accelerator to the floor. The tires shrieked in protest on the pavement. We shot backward out of the driveway, the hunter leaping out of the way at the last second. I spun the wheel, shifted into drive, and floored it. We rocketed down the street, past our running, screaming neighbors, past the burning pyre of the Miller's house, past the confused, regrouping aliens. We were out. We were alive. We were free. But as I looked in the rearview mirror at the chaos and the fire, at the dark shapes now turning their full, undivided attention to the single speeding car, I knew we weren't just survivors. We were fugitives. And we had just declared war. The world outside the car was a blur of chaos and fire. I drove with a singular, desperate focus, my hands locked on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The sleepy, familiar streets of Havenwood had transformed into a war zone. Panicked neighbors, finally shaken from their trance by the explosion, ran in every direction, their screams drowned out by the blare of a dozen car alarms. Through the chaos, the aliens moved, their silent, orderly harvest shattered. They were now trying to restore control, their forms appearing like dark phantoms in the swirling smoke and flashing alarm lights. A hunter glided into the street ahead of us, and I swerved violently, the tires screaming as I mounted the curb, sending a shower of sparks from a flattened mailbox. We were the source of the chaos. We were the wrench in their silent, perfect machine. And they knew it. I could feel their collective attention, a palpable, hateful pressure, focused on our fleeing car. But the sheer pandemonium we had unleashed was our shield. It gave us the cover we needed. I pushed the car faster, blowing through dead traffic lights, past the abandoned cars that had been the first harbingers of this long night. Finally, I saw the sign for the highway, a beacon of hope in the madness. I took the on-ramp at a dangerous speed, the car groaning in protest, and in seconds, the burning lights of Havenwood were shrinking in my rearview mirror. We were out. The sounds of the alarms and the screams faded, replaced by the roar of the engine and the whistle of the wind. We were alone on a dark, empty highway, swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness of the American night. The adrenaline that had fueled me for hours began to recede, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. Every injury, every bruise, every raw nerve, made itself known at once. I sagged against the steering wheel, my body trembling with exhaustion and the aftershocks of sheer terror. "Keep driving," Michael grunted from the back seat, his voice tight with pain. "Don't stop. Not for anything." Sarah, who had been a pillar of silent, terrified strength, finally sprang into action. "The first aid kit," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "In the glove compartment." For the next 10 minutes, as I drove numbly into the darkness, she became our medic. She cleaned and bandaged the gash on Michael's head, her movements becoming more steady and sure with every second. She fashioned a crude but effective sling for his broken arm from the emergency blanket I had used to carry the shard, a lifetime ago. She examined the ugly splinter in my shoulder, declaring that it had to stay put until we could find a real doctor, and taped a thick gauze pad over it. We were a broken, battered crew, but we were alive, and we were together. The immediate question hung in the air: where do we go? The next town, Northwood, was 30 miles away. Could we make it there? Could we walk into a police station and tell them this insane story? "My phone's still dead," I said, breaking the silence. "Mine too," Michael groaned from the back. "Wait," Sarah said. She fumbled in the pocket of her robe. "Mine was upstairs, on the charger." She pulled out her phone. We all watched, holding our breath, as she pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, the familiar logo of the manufacturer sight so normal it felt like a miracle. A collective sigh of relief filled the car. It was a link, a connection to the world we thought we had lost. "Call 911, I said, my voice urgent. She swiped the screen, her fingers trembling, and hit the emergency call button. She put the phone to her ear. We waited. After a few seconds, she shook her head, her face falling. "Nothing," she said, her voice cracking with disappointment. "Just a fast, busy signal. The cell networks must still be down here." But even as she spoke, the phone, now connected to the wider world beyond Havenwood's blackout zone, began to buzz. A single notification appeared on the screen. Then another. And another. A flood of delayed alerts and news updates began to pour in, a torrent of information from a world we had been severed from. Sarah's eyes scanned the screen. Her expression of disappointment slowly morphed into one of utter confusion, and then into a dawning, creeping horror that was more terrible than anything I had seen on her face all night. "What is it?" I asked, my stomach twisting into a cold knot. She didn't answer. She just held the phone up for me to see in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I glanced at the screen. The notifications weren't from local news outlets. They were from national and international ones. CNN, widespread communications blackouts reported in rural communities across North America. Officials urging calm. BBC News, similar phenomena reported in isolated villages from Spain to Ukraine. Cause unknown. Reuters, reports of unexplained aerial lights and seismic anomalies surfacing from dozens of locations in South America and Australia. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the phone from her, my eyes frantically scanning the headlines. It wasn't just Havenwood. It was a town in Oregon, a village in the Italian Alps, a remote community in Brazil. Hundreds, maybe thousands of small, isolated towns, all over the world, all reporting the same thing. A communications blackout, strange lights, and a period of lost time. The truth, in all its global catastrophic scale, crashed down on me. This wasn't an invasion of Havenwood. This was the invasion of Earth. A synchronized, planet-wide event, a silent, perfectly executed coup. They hadn't landed in one place. They had landed everywhere at once, in all the quiet, forgotten corners of the world, away from the major population centers, away from the centers of power. They were establishing 1,000 beachheads, all at the same time. I let the phone fall into my lap. The car hummed along the empty highway, its headlights cutting a lonely path into a darkness that now seemed absolute. We hadn't escaped. There was no Northwood to run to. Northwood was just another Havenwood. There was no police station, no army, no one to call for help. Everyone was fighting their own isolated battle, or worse, had already been harvested, just like our neighbors. I looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the ghastly light of the phone screen. I glanced in the rearview mirror at Michael, his head slumped back, his eyes closed in pain and dawning despair. We were 3 refugees in a car, armed with a first aid kit and a quarter tank of gas. And our enemy was the entire world. We hadn't escaped. We had just broken out of our single, isolated cell and into the general population of a planetary prison. I gripped the steering wheel, my gaze fixed on the endless, dark road ahead, and for the first time, I felt the true crushing weight of what we had to do next. It wasn't about running anymore. It was about surviving. And somehow, in a world that was already lost, we had to find a way to fight back.